Chapter 20. Father, what did you say? Chu Qingyan bought a stick of candied hawthorn from the seller and handed it to her father. She then remembered what her father had said earlier and couldn't help but tilt her head and ask. Unfortunately, at this time, her father only had eyes for the candied hawthorn. How could he care about what she asked? No, her father still had her mother in his eyes. Look, her father had already taken the stick of candied hawthorn and ran to find her mother. Chu Qingyan shook her head and smiled helplessly. She suddenly remembered the people she had met on the street and couldn't help but turn her head to look. Unfortunately, the crowd was bustling and she couldn't see the outstanding person anymore. Just as Chu Qingyan turned her head to continue walking, the person in luxurious black clothing stood under the tree, looking in her direction with cold eyes. A light breeze blew, blowing up a corner of the black veil, and the silver luster on the side of his face faintly shone under the sunlight. Lord, that little girl is the Chu clan's young miss. A subordinate followed his master's gaze and immediately reported. N. Xiao Su replied indifferently. He already recognized her without the subordinate's reminder. She was the girl who had saved him in Mao village and accidentally became his betrothed. She wasn't tall, not even reaching his chest. She still had a childish air to her, and when she smiled, she revealed two small canine teeth and shallow dimples. It was no wonder that Xiao Su could see her so clearly. Whether it was when he saved her in Mao village or when he accidentally met her in the Chu clan, he had never seen this girl in broad daylight. He was still somewhat curious about this courageous, intelligent, and cautious little girl. However, while he was curious, he did not pay too much attention to Chu Qingyan. From what he knew, Chu Qingyan would leave his line of sight very soon. That was because she would eventually leave the Chu clan and escape this engagement. Master, it seems that the Chu clan's surveillance of this young miss is getting tighter and tighter. The subordinate couldn't help but say in surprise. Xiao Su raised his head and looked around. Sure enough, he saw several servants wearing the Chu clan's clothes hiding in the crowd. This shoddy tracking technique could deceive Chu Qingyan and the others, but it couldn't escape his eyes. Where is the fire spirit? Xiao Su frowned. Logically speaking, old Master Chu was about to celebrate his birthday, and Chu Qingyan should be secretly preparing to escape. How could she be in the mood to go shopping? Moreover, there were so many people following her. If the Chu family was not suspicious of her, then her plan had been exposed. Only Hualing knew what was going on. As soon as his voice fell, Hualing was already summoned over. Hualing smiled unnaturally at Lord. He thought that Lord didn't notice that something was wrong just now, so he could escape. Who knew that he would be pulled back before he could go far? Lord. Reason. Before Hualing could finish speaking, he was interrupted by Xiao Su's cold words. Hualing rubbed his nose, not daring to hide anything as he explained everything in detail. After Xiao Su heard this, his eyes fell on Hualing. It was like 1,000-pound stone was pressing down on Hualing, making him unable to move. Hualing, you disobeyed this king's orders. Although it was a question, there was a certain tone to it. Hualing immediately knelt down. Lord, this subordinate did not stop it because of you. Xiao Su looked at the stubborn Hualing kneeling on the ground and closed his eyes. Finally, he slowly said, don't do it again. Hualing stood up and then carefully raised his head to ask, Lord, then now, I'm afraid it's not a question of whether she wants to escape or not, but that she no longer has a chance. From what Hualing had told him about the confrontation between Chu Qingyan and the Chu clan, he had already guessed that Chu Qingyan's strategy was to cut off all means of retreat and sink all boats. He really could not tell that this was a strategy that a 10-year-old girl could come up with, and it really surprised him. But it was hard to tell if this girl could safely live until the day of her wedding. Xiao Su felt pity for her in his heart. The Chu family framed her and caused her to walk into a whirlpool. And because of him, she might be consigned to eternal damnation in the future. You said that she wants to find a doctor for her father? Xiao Su asked. Yes, Lord, I heard that she wants to cure her father's illness. But it has been more than 10 years, and in this subordinate's opinion, this matter is very uncertain. Huo Ling did not hide his disapproval of Chu Qingyan's decision. If there's a chance, recommend divine physician Luo to her, but do it secretly and don't let her find out. If he could make it up to her now, then it would be. Huo Ling's eyes widened as he looked at Lord in disbelief. Did he hear wrongly? This was the first time he saw Lord being so concerned about a girl, and it was such a young girl. Could it be that Lord suffered some stimulation outside the city? Did he become a pedophile? Although he didn't want Chu Qingyan to run away from the wedding because he didn't want to embarrass Lord and let the bride run away, now that he saw his master protecting Chu Qingyan, Huo Ling felt a little upset. How was this little girl worthy of his master whom he respected so much? Compared to Huo Ling's messy thoughts, Xiao Su had already turned around and left indifferently. He didn't know that his subordinate's heart was in turmoil. On the other hand, Chu Qingyan found out the address of a divine physician under the guidance of a passerby and immediately brought her parents to trace it back. Until they stopped in front of a shabby stall. May I ask if you are the miraculous divine physician Zhu? Although she had doubts in her heart, Chu Qingyan still asked respectfully. Divine physician, you're calling me? The gray-robed man, who had his back to them and was immersed in something, immediately raised his head and revealed a shifty-eyed face. Chu Qingyan was frightened by his sudden action and retreated. She immediately recovered her calm expression and replied with a smile, "Yes, divine physician, this junior is calling you." Seeing Chu Qingyan like this, the man happily stroked the mustache above his lips and asked with a shifty smile, "That's right, divine physician Zhu is this one. I don't know if little miss is doing divination or fortune-telling." Divination? Fortune-telling? Chu Qingyan was stunned. This scene changed too quickly and she couldn't immediately react. Why did asking for medical treatment become fortune-telling? That's right. If it's fortune-telling, it's drawing lots. If it's fortune-telling, it's directly stretching out your palm. But no matter which one it is, this divine physician can guarantee that it will be flawless. Little miss, do you want to have your fortune told or do you want to have it told for your family of 3? I'll give you a discount and treat it as the price for the 2 of you. How about it? This divine physician is very compassionate. This divine physician is a fortune teller within a radius of 100 miles. You should know that revealing the secrets of heaven will shorten your lifespan. This divine physician is risking his life to tell your fortune. After saying that, this man had an impassioned and self-sacrificing look, causing Father Chu to divert a bit of his attention from the candied hawthorn to look at him. Aren't you a doctor who treats patients? Why are you in the fortune-telling business? Chu Qingyan pursed her lips. Could it be that the doctors nowadays had a side job of fortune-telling? My surname is Zhu and I'm called divine physician. That's right. Little miss, I didn't say that I'm divine physician because I'm called divine physician. Chu Qingyan facepalmed. So she had met an unreliable swindler. Pig, your nose has 2 holes. Pig, your ears are so big. You can't hear me scolding you for being stupid even if I flap my fan. At this moment, Father Chu's joyful off-key singing drifted over with the wind. Chu Qingyan silently turned her eyes away. Chapter 21. After ascertaining that the divine doctor wasn't divine Dr. Zhu, Chu Qingyan held her forehead and left with her parents, ignoring divine Dr. Zhu's persuasion to stay. Chu Qingyan chuckled. No wonder those coachmen from the Chu family had a strange smile on their faces when they knew that she was looking for divine Dr. Zhu. So they already knew who divine Dr. Zhu was. From the looks of it, even though she had laid her cards on the table with the Chu family was still indifferent towards her and had a wait-and-see attitude. But Chu Qingyan wasn't disappointed as she didn't expect the Chu family to be of any help in this matter. At this moment, Father Chu was holding Mother Chu's hand as they walked happily in front, ignoring the gazes of the surrounding people. Mother Chu only cared about Father Chu and ignored the strange gazes of the others. Chu Qingyan felt a faint pity in her heart. The relationship between her parents was still as deep as in the modern era. If her father could regain his consciousness, then everything would be even better. She didn't know when that marriage decree would be fulfilled. No matter what, she had to find a doctor who could treat her father's illness as soon as possible, otherwise she wouldn't be able to sleep well. Everything that happened to Chu Qingyan was transmitted to Xiao Su's ears. There wasn't any ripple on his face as he tapped on the inner wall of the carriage and asked his subordinate outside, "Where is Divine Dr. Luo now?" Reporting to Master, "Ever since Divine Physician Luo left the palace 3 months ago, we have not been able to find any traces of him. This subordinate will send people to closely search for his whereabouts these few days." A respectful voice came from outside. Xiao Su hummed in agreement. "Master, we will be entering the palace in another incense's time." When Xiao Su heard that, his indifferent gaze landed on the slightly swaying carriage curtains. The wind blew and the familiar street scenery leaped into his eyes. His thoughts slowly drifted away. 1 year, he hadn't stepped foot in this place for an entire year. But it was a pity that even though he was far away, those people had never thought of stopping. A smear of ridicule flashed past that pair of black glazed eyes. It was as fast as a gust of wind and it was hidden in the depths of the black glazed eyes. When one looked at it seriously, that pair of beautiful eyes were calm and no emotions could be seen. "His Royal Highness, the Empress has been waiting for you for several days. Yesterday, she even smashed a set of blue and white porcelain tea set. Today, you're finally here, don't be as stubborn as before. If you make the Empress angry again, I'm afraid that it won't just be a set of tea set." Xiao Su had just stepped into Chaoyang Palace when an elderly palace servant came up to greet him with joy. But there was clear disapproval in her words. Huo Ling looked at this palace servant and her eyebrows jumped. This palace servant was called Luo Yun. She was the happiness of Empress Liang's side. Since Empress Liang was born, she had been by her side. She could be considered Empress Liang's wet nurse. In Empress Liang's heart, her position was not low. Therefore, this Luo Yun often relied on Empress Liang's favor and frequently spoke rudely to their lord. She did not have the self-awareness of being a servant. If it wasn't for Empress Liang's face, with their lord's personality, this person would have died countless times already. Xiao Su furrowed his brows. Even though he disliked her preaching every time they met, she was still someone that Mu Empress valued. Xiao Su looked at her and after giving a slight nod, he strode into Chaoyang Palace. Luo Yun was shocked by His Royal Highness' faint glance just now and her legs couldn't help but feel weak. After not seeing for a year, His Royal Highness' personality had become even colder. Without thinking too much, Luo Yun immediately followed His Royal Highness' steps. Xiao Su had just stepped into the inner hall when an unknown object flew in front of him. He furrowed his brows but did not move. The white object brushed past the corner of his brow. With a peng sound, it hit the door post behind him and exploded. If it had been just a little bit more, it would have hit his head. Xiao Su didn't know if he should be happy or unlucky. The teacup didn't hit its target, making the attacker very impatient. A gloomy female voice came from the center of the hall. "You still know to return to the palace? Ben Gong thought that you had been playing around outside for the past year and that Ben Gong didn't exist in your eyes at all." In the main hall of Chaoyang Palace, a woman in a flowery palace dress sat on a deep purple and delicately carved chaise lounge. The outside was covered with a layer of golden gauze. The hem of her dress was embroidered with phoenixes flapping their wings. Her makeup was exquisite and her face was beautiful. However, her two thin eyebrows were furrowed and her eyes were filled with anger. "I don't dare." Xiao Su didn't become emotional because of the censure of the person in front of him. He stood in place with his head slightly lowered and his face expressionless. "Don't dare? Ha, is there anything in this world that you don't dare to do?" The person sitting on the chaise lounge was none other than Xiao Su's biological mother, the Empress of Sichuan Kingdom. At this time, her eyes were filled with ridicule and her tone was exaggerated. Ben Gong has urged and invited you many times, but I still can't summon you back. No wonder the outside world always says that you are unpredictable and cold. It seems that it's not false at all. Even Ben Gong, your mother, can't influence your decisions. You really are Ben Gong's good son. In the face of Empress Ai's sarcasm, Xiaosu only moved his eyes and then asked faintly, Empress Mother, if you're only looking for me to say this, then I will take my leave first. Stop. What's with your attitude? Before she could finish speaking, her son was about to leave. Empress Liang was so angry that she almost couldn't breathe. Luo Yun immediately stepped forward and gently patted Empress Liang's back, telling her to calm down. At the same time, she rebuked Xiaosu, His Royal Highness, it's not easy for you to come back. Don't make Her Imperial Highness angry again. When Xiaosu heard this, he didn't want to stay a moment longer. He was about to leave when he heard the person behind him say angrily, Xiaosu, this time, Ben Gong doesn't care what you think in your heart. No matter what, you have to break off this engagement with the Chu clan. Otherwise, Ben Gong will no longer recognize you as a son. Xiaosu thought it was a bit funny. Hearing Empress Mother say this, it seemed like he was forcing the marriage alliance with the Chu clan. When Empress Mother mentioned the reason for summoning him back to the palace, Xiaosu turned to look at her with a calm expression. Empress Mother, I'm afraid that I can't make the decision on this matter. The Chu clan was chosen by Imperial Grandfather and the marriage alliance was bestowed by Imperial Father. If you have any objections, you can tell Imperial Father. No matter what you discuss with Imperial Father, I won't have any objections. Empress Liang had already argued with Sichuan Emperor about this matter. If it weren't for the fact that she had no other choice, how could she have gotten so angry? When she saw that this son of hers didn't care at all, she was even angrier. When she saw his current attitude, Empress Liang became even angrier. Xiaosu, look at yourself. You don't fight, and you don't resist? Do you think you can get away with this? Ben Gong is telling you, that's completely impossible. Relying on Ai's current glory to fight for and resist? Xiaosu pointed at the mask on his face as he spoke in a mocking tone. Empress Liang's gaze landed on the silver mask. Her eyes flashed and she gave a cold humph. So what if you're disfigured? You're my, Liang Yuan's, only son and Sichuan's eldest son. All of this belongs to you. As long as you work hard, Empress Mother will support you. What are you afraid of? Xiaosu looked at his mother, whose face was distorted by desire. He pursed his lips but didn't say anything. Empress Liang thought that he had tacitly agreed and continued, don't worry. If you can't cancel the marriage, it's fine. Dead people can't get married. Empress Mother has a way. Xiaosu felt that the life of intrigue in the inner palace had completely distorted Empress Mother's mentality. In front of others, she was dignified and virtuous, tolerant and magnanimous. This was the world's evaluation of Empress Mother, but they didn't know the side of her in private. These words were torn to pieces. He didn't finish listening before he walked out of Zhaoyang Palace, leaving all the shouting behind him. Just as he walked out of Zhaoyang Palace, he saw Fu Wang's right-hand man, Eunuch Chao, respectfully waiting outside the hall. Xiaosu raised his head to look at the setting sun, his eyes as dark as the horizon. Chapter 22. The shadows of the bamboo covered the bluestone path, and the moonlight was drowned out by the darkness of the night. When the boots stepped on the bluestone, the shadows would spread. Step by step, it was as if what they were stepping on was not a path, but the silence of the night. In the strictly guarded imperial palace, other than the orderly patrolling footsteps and the sound of the wind blowing leaves, no other sound could be heard. The bold and powerful words, Imperial Study, shone with a dignified luster above his head. Eunuch Chao went in first. After a while, he came out of the hall and bowed slightly to welcome him in. Xiaosu looked straight ahead as he stepped into the Imperial Study. A bright palace lantern was placed beside the table, illuminating the entire inner hall and the person scribbling on the table. The bright yellow dragon robe seemed to absorb all the light. The light flowed on the robe, and the golden silk was like the brightest fire in the dark night, making people not dare to look directly at it. I pay my respects to Imperial Father. Xiao Su's cold voice rang out in the hall, neither servile nor overbearing. The person drawing did not speak. The brush in his hand was still moving, as if he did not hear the greeting of the person in front of him. Time passed little by little. Xiao Su was not in a hurry. He maintained his standing position and waited for the person in front of him to finish his drawing. When there were only a few strokes left, the Sichuan Emperor seemed to have just noticed his presence. His tone was tinged with a trace of displeasure. You've been urged and invited repeatedly, and now you've entered the palace. Has your temper become so spoiled after being outside for a year? I do not dare. Xiao Su replied unhurriedly. This was the second time he had said this tonight. To others, the emperor was the closest family in the world. To him, the emperor was the most distant stranger. The corners of Xiao Su's lips curled up slightly, and a faint self-deprecating smile flashed across his lips. Sichuan Emperor did not notice Xiao Su's mood. He only heard his usual cold tone and swallowed the words of reproach that were about to come out of his mouth. After all, over the past year, he had helped Sichuan subdue many nomads who were difficult to discipline. If he was too strict with him, he was afraid that his subordinates would not be convinced. Therefore, Sichuan Emperor paused. When he saw the silver mask again, he gave up the idea of lecturing. After all, this son of his was no longer qualified to compete for power with Ranner. Thus, the Sichuan Emperor softened his tone, but his expression remained stern. Su, you're not young anymore. You can't be so willful anymore. It's time to start a family. Xiao Su raised his eyebrows and looked straight at the Sichuan Emperor. He finally got to the point. Meeting Xiao Su's knowing gaze, the Emperor of Xixian was a little startled. He knew that his eldest son had a clear mind and must have already known about this matter. But thinking of Yu Yu's instructions, he cleared his throat, looked away, and pretended not to see anything. Not allowing Xiao Su to say anything, he said, Previously, we picked a few girls for you, but they were all delayed for various reasons. Father Emperor and your mother Empress were very anxious for you. Coincidentally, your imperial grandfather returned to the capital this time and helped you pick a family. Their character and appearance are not bad, and they are a good match for you. So this time, Father Emperor is relieved. Although the other party is still young, this is not a problem. Xiao Su pursed his lips. Her character and appearance are not bad. Imperial Father probably does not even know what she looks like. Seeing that Xiao Su was silent and did not answer, the Sichuan Emperor's face suddenly darkened. What? Could it be that you have objections to this marriage? Let me tell you, the marriage has already been decreed. A monarch's words are not a joke. It is not up to you to decide. Was this Imperial Father's true intention? Xiao Su expressionlessly replied, I do not dare. Blood is thicker than water. These were the only words that could be used to describe kinship. The Sichuan Emperor stroked his beard in satisfaction when he heard this. Only then did he put down the brush in his hand and walk to Xiao Su with his hands behind his back. He then patted his shoulder. This is Jin's good son. You must believe that your imperial grandfather is doing this for your own good. So, don't be angry. Live well with that girl from the Chu family. Perhaps in a few years, you will be able to give birth to a fat imperial great-grandson for your imperial grandfather. Xiao Su's lips moved, but in the end, he did not say anything. He silently agreed. If he wanted to receive a word of praise from him, he would have to give up all chances of sitting on the throne. To his imperial father, not going against his decisions and unconditionally making way for his most beloved prince was what he should do. Alright, you've worked hard this year. Next month is your fourth imperial brother's birthday. At that time, bring that girl from the Chu family over for your imperial mother to take a look. That way, she won't always nag in Zhen's ear. Seeing that Xiao Su had no objections, the Sichuan emperor was in a good mood. He patted his son's shoulder a few more times as if to comfort him. Yes. After resolving this matter, the Sichuan emperor was in the mood to properly inquire about his actions this year. After hearing this, the Sichuan emperor was both happy and worried. He was happy that the Sichuan Empire's territory had expanded once again, but worried that this eldest prince was so outstanding. How would Ranner surpass him in the future? If there is nothing else, I will take my leave first. The Sichuan emperor's complicated expression did not escape Xiao Su's eyes. His eyes darkened, and then he lowered his head and said. This was exactly what the Sichuan emperor wanted. This eldest prince had never been close to him. After talking about business, there was nothing to talk about. This made the Sichuan emperor think of the fourth prince, Xiao Ran. This child could always make him laugh. He was sensible, well-behaved, and intelligent. Even the ministers in the imperial college were full of praise for him. Thinking of this, the Sichuan emperor's mood improved again. He nodded and let Xiao Su leave. This time, Yu would not be worried about the marriage between Su, and the Chu family. Although he and Su's relationship was very dull, he still understood this son of his. He would never let him worry about anything. He would never go against his orders. It seemed that tonight, Yu would be able to completely relax. On the ink-colored plaque above his head, the words were exceptionally clear. Neutral and benevolent. It was like silent sarcasm. Xiao Su did not stay any longer. He left the imperial study without looking back. Eunuch Chao looked at the tall and straight figure. He then looked back at the emperor's smile. He could not help but lower his head. This kind of thing had happened too many times. He was already used to it. But even a spectator like him was familiar with it. It was unknown whether the people in the bureau were numb to it. Sichuan emperor walked out of the imperial study with relaxed steps. He headed for the most luxurious and exquisite palace in the inner palace, the Moon Palace. Sichuan emperor's most beloved concubine, Fu Yu, who was also the mother of the Sichuan emperor's most beloved son, Xiao Ran. Everyone in Sichuan kingdom knew that the most dignified person in the inner palace was Empress Liang. However, the most powerful person was Consort Yu. A lot of things would change after tonight. Meanwhile, Chu Qingyan, who was shopping on the streets, did not know what was waiting for her after tonight. Xiao Su did not know either. Chapter 23. You don't have to worry about Su, and the Chu family's marriage anymore. The Sichuan emperor hugged his beloved concubine's shoulders and closed his eyes to comfort her. The King of England's marriage has finally been finalized. I am very happy for Sister Empress. Otherwise, there would be several children around Su's age. After so many years, there is no one by the King of England's side. I am also worried. A voice that seemed to be both angry and amused sounded in the Sichuan emperor's ears. A beautiful woman was half lying on the ground. Her appearance was outstanding, and her skin was as white as snow. Her crescent moons were crescent moons, and she was so charming that people couldn't bear to look away. She was indeed the most beautiful woman in the Sichuan kingdom 20 years ago. Although 20 years had passed, time didn't seem to have left any traces on her body. She was still as beautiful as ever, which was enough to make people jealous. This person was the fourth prince's birth mother, the second daughter of the Fu family, and the concubine most favored by the emperor, Fu Yuyue. At this moment, Fu Yuyue was twirling her long hair with her fingers, and a proud look flashed across her eyes. She had finally gotten rid of Xiao Su, who was a thorn in her side. It was worth celebrating. If Su knew that you cared about him so much, he wouldn't treat you so coldly. The Sichuan emperor patted her hands and said with some pity. Fu Yuyue seemed to be wronged and magnanimous as she replied, "The King of England is indifferent by nature. Even Sister Empress couldn't obtain his favor, let alone me, who is not related by blood. Your Majesty doesn't need to feel sorry for me." Hearing this, the Sichuan Emperor was even more dissatisfied with his eldest son. "Su, is insensible. You don't need to care about him." Fu Yuyue agreed softly, and a light flashed across her eyes. "Your Majesty, I heard that Chu Qingyan is still young and probably doesn't know many rules. Why don't we move her to the King of England's residence first and let the King of England train her well? Otherwise, with the King of England's temper, it will be difficult for Chu Qingyan to get along with Chu Qingyan when she grows up and marries him. Why don't we let them get along first and wait until Chu Qingyan reaches marriageable age before they get married?" The Sichuan Emperor, who was patting his beloved concubine's hand, paused and said hesitantly, "I'm afraid it's against the rules." Fu Yuyue looked angry. "Rules are made by people. Moreover, the King of England is also special. He is 8 years younger than Miss Chu. Moreover, the marriages that have been arranged for the King of England in the past few years have all been," Fu Yuyue paused and said considerately, "I think that if I put her by the King of England's side, with the King of England's ability, he will definitely be able to keep her safe and sound." Sichuan Emperor had guessed what his beloved concubine was going to say. He recalled that the previous marriages had all ended with the sudden death of the bride, so he was a bit hesitant. Seeing that the Sichuan Emperor was a bit tempted, a smile flashed across Fu Yuyue's eyes. Sichuan Emperor saw that she was waiting for his answer with a serious expression. Sichuan Emperor said in a hoarse voice, "Everything will be as my beloved concubine." Her voice faded away. The pendant on the gauze curtain swayed gently, and the palace maids in the inner hall silently retreated again. Sichuan Emperor didn't notice the flash of success in her eyes. The candlelight in the dormitory would probably stay lit for a while. The night was getting darker, and everything was quiet. Xiao Su had just sat in the carriage when a report sounded. "Lord, Her Majesty the Empress just sent someone to ask about your conversation with His Majesty." "There's no need to respond." Xiao Su closed his eyes to rest and answered without thinking. "But..." The subordinate hesitated. If Lord didn't respond, Her Majesty the Empress wouldn't let it go. At that time, his lord would be the one to suffer. He was a bit embarrassed. As if sensing his subordinate's worry, Xiao Su opened his eyes. There was a hint of helpless compromise in his gaze. "Go and tell Imperial Mother that Imperial Father has made up his mind. This prince can't change it. She also knows Imperial Father's temper. Let her be at ease and wait to be a mother-in-law." "Yes." The subordinate bitterly agreed. In this world, there was no one else like His Highness, treating his loved ones like strangers. "Lord, someone just came to report that second prince knew you were coming back, so he had people send over 2 Western region women. He said that the Western region dance isn't bad, so he wanted to give it to you. Your subordinates couldn't stop him no matter how hard they tried. Second prince also said that if master didn't accept them, he would be angry with you." Hualing reported the news he just received. He was very speechless inside. This second prince liked to search for beautiful women the most. He liked to send people to Lord's palace whenever he had nothing to do. If it wasn't for Lord rejecting him with a black face every time, the palace would have already been turned into another winter jasmine courtyard by second prince. But he never thought that second prince would still send people to the palace without fear. Did he really think that Lord couldn't do anything to him? "Throw them out." Xiao Su replied without even thinking. After not seeing him for a year, second royal brother was still doing things his own way. No wonder his good reputation had risen when he came back this time. Liking the new and disliking the old, indulging in excessive debauchery. Xiao Su impatiently raised his eyebrows, not wanting to talk about this matter anymore. Hualing happily accepted this order. He also didn't like the king's palace being messed up by these vulgar women. The carriage moved forward. The capital was especially lively at night. All kinds of food vendors were on the side of the road to attract customers, and the sound of hawking filled the entire street. The carriage moving forward seemed to be out of place in this busy city, as if the liveliness here had nothing to do with it. The carriage entered another road and headed towards the King of England's palace. The people living on both sides of this road were high-ranking officials and nobles, so it was quiet. The lively laughter and shouts were all left behind by the carriage. "Lord, the Chu family's young miss has been looking for a doctor for Father Chu. Unfortunately, the results aren't ideal." Huo Ling was a person who couldn't stand silence. Seeing that the carriage was silent, he couldn't help but rack his brain to find a topic. After thinking about it, only that little girl could attract Lord's attention. When asked why he felt this way, he couldn't say it. It was just intuition. A calm voice came out of the carriage and nothing else. Huo Ling couldn't help but feel that he had guessed wrong and planned to shut up. But unexpectedly, the person in the carriage said, "If she finds a chance to escape, you can still help her. It's fine as long as she doesn't notice." "Yes," Huo Ling replied in surprise. After the mishap with the godly doctor, they searched for a few more days without any results. Chu Qingyan had her parents stay in the Chu family while she took Shan Cha and a few servants on a journey to find a doctor. Another day without any results. Chu Qingyan returned to the palace somewhat frustrated. In the past few days, she had almost run through all the large and small medical halls in the capital. She didn't even let go of the medicine stalls in the small streets and alleys, but she still couldn't find a single person who could treat her father's illness. There had been an honest old doctor who had suggested to her that this kind of illness that had dragged on for 10 years could only be treated by the Imperial Hospital of the Imperial Palace. Chu Qingyan felt that this suggestion was a bit difficult. After all, she didn't have any connections to the Imperial Hospital and it was even more impossible for the Chu family. Before the bestowment of marriage, the Chu family was just a poor family with no connections. Even if they had, they wouldn't waste it on her father. Just as Chu Qingyan was thinking about how to get in touch with the Imperial Hospital, she heard a commotion in the front yard. She wanted to ignore it, but when she heard a familiar cry, her footsteps paused and she immediately ran towards the source of the sound. Chapter 24. Chu Qingyan wasn't a meddlesome person, especially in this kind of big house. But at this moment, she was already panicking, because she recognized her mother's voice in the noise just now. Her footsteps quickened, and the noise and crying gradually became clearer. Yuanlang, Mrs. Chu, who was covered in tears, was now clinging to the side of the lake, shouting at the top of her lungs. Chu Qingyan looked in the direction of her mother's shouting, and saw an extremely familiar figure struggling in the lake. On the shore, a few youngsters who were watching the show were laughing unscrupulously, until Chu Qingyan's cold gaze swept over, and they shrank back slightly, but then quickly straightened their backs, and looked back at her with contempt. Chu Qingyan couldn't be bothered to argue with these people, and quickly rushed up, intending to enter the water to save her father who had fallen into the water. When the people who were originally watching by the side saw that she was about to jump into the water, they were so frightened that they quickly surrounded Chu Qingyan, and Shan Cha, who was following closely behind Chu Qingyan, hugged her waist vigorously. Ninth young mistress must not jump. If ninth young mistress couldn't be saved, then the entire Chu family would have to pay with their lives. The bestowed marriage was there. If anything happened to ninth young mistress, the higher-ups would investigate, and the paper couldn't wrap the fire. The originally cold people were now like ants on a hot pan, trying their best to persuade her. Ninth young mistress, your body is delicate, and this spring water is piercing to the bone, don't do anything stupid. Servant A, yes. Ninth young mistress, don't be rash. Servant B, hearing the servant's bitter cries, Chu Qingyan felt irritated, and seeing that her father was about to lose his strength from struggling, she said angrily, let go of me, I'll go save him myself, or you all go down and save him for me. If anything happens to my father, Chu Qingyan, have no other abilities, but I have more than enough ability to make you all suffer. Chu Qingyan's aura was fully released, and immediately suppressed the entire scene, followed by a splash. 2, 3, 7 or 8 bartenders scrambled into the lake and swam towards Chu Machen's father, who was struggling wildly. In the end, the group of people carried Mr. Chu to the shore, exhausted. Chu Qingyan, who was comforting Mrs. Chu, immediately went up to them. When she saw her father's pale face, she was angry and distressed. She turned to look at the youths standing proudly under the tree, and her tone was unexpectedly calm. Chu Dekhang, Chu Shibao, Chu Endi, please tell me what's going on. Just now, when she saw them watching a good show and stopping the servants from saving her father, she had already guessed that this matter was related to them. What's going on? Wasn't it just your foolish father who wanted to pick the lotus leaves in the lake? He wasn't careful and couldn't come up. What, you want to blame it on us? Chu Qingyan, don't make us the scapegoat. Chu Dekhang was the oldest, and he was the first to speak up. His gaze was somewhat evasive, but his tone was somewhat stiff. That's right, calling us brothers by our full names. You don't have any manners at all. You really have no manners. Chu Shibao heard his eldest brother speak up and echoed, and his back became more confident. That's not it. You were the ones who said there was treasure in the lake, but when I went into the water, I didn't find anything. I even drank a lot of water. You're all bad children. Mr. Chu coughed and said aggrievedly. The truth was already out, and there was no need for Chu Qingyan to say anything more. When he received Chu Qingyan's cold gaze, Chu Dekhang was unwilling to fall behind and said angrily, eldest uncle wanted to go himself, what does it have to do with us? Besides, eldest uncle is a fool, how can a fool's words be convincing? Chu Qingyan nodded and stared back at Chu Qingyan. She was only a 10-year-old girl, there was nothing to be afraid of. Second uncle, third uncle, and fourth uncle's sons were all here. Chu Qingyan snorted coldly. Chu Qingyan didn't want to be entangled with them. She asked her mother to bring her father back to his room, and she slowly walked to the lakeside. There were some things that she didn't want to do, but if she wanted to do it, she had to put an end to future troubles and get it done once and for all. The crowd didn't understand why Miss Jiu suddenly stopped talking and instead strolled leisurely by the lakeside. It wasn't until Miss Jiu's feet stepped on the edge of the lake that their expressions changed. Was Miss Jiu going to jump into the lake? This thought flashed through their minds, and some people in the crowd came forward to dissuade her, while others immediately ran to the main courtyard to inform old Madame Chu. Chu Qingyan glanced at the figure running out of the main courtyard from the corner of her eye, and the corner of her mouth curved. Then, she moved her hands and feet, concentrating on the center of the lake. Chu Qingyan, what are you doing? Originally, Chu Qingyan would continue to question them, but they didn't expect her to walk to the lakeside without saying a word. The confused Chu Dekhang was so scared that he couldn't speak clearly. Hearing this, Chu Qingyan responded with a faint smile, didn't you tell my father that there was a treasure in the lake? Qingyan is also very curious, so I want to take a look. Who knows, I might even be able to bring it back for my father. Chu Dekhang and the other two were dumbfounded. This was really a pair of crazy father and daughter. At this time, one of the servants saw that the three young masters still hadn't figured out what was at stake, and couldn't help but say sorrowfully, "Three young masters, hurry and stop Miss Jiu. If anything happens to her, our Chu family will be punished by the higher-ups." When the three heard this, they remembered their parents' instructions. They must never provoke this little ancestor, so they were so scared that their faces turned pale. Chu Qingyan didn't care about what they were thinking, because the people she was waiting for had arrived. Old Master Chu, Old Madam Chu, Second Old Master Chu, Madam Wang, Madam Xing, Madam Lin, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, she didn't expect that her actions would actually gather all 7 members of the Chu family's management. She wondered if she could summon a dragon pearl. Qingyan, if you have something to say, we can talk it out. Don't jump into the lake. The sharp-eyed Madame Xing immediately exclaimed when she saw Chu Qingyan step out of the lake. With Madame Xing's loud voice, everyone's attention was focused on Chu Qingyan's feet. When old Madame Chu saw her feet hanging in the air, she was so scared that she almost fainted. Chu Qingyan tilted her head. Eldest brother and the others said that there was a treasure in the lake. Qingyan wants to take a look. Looking at those mischievous eyes, old Madame Chu's heart was filled with panic. However, the Chu family couldn't leave her now, so old Madame Chu immediately replied, "Don't listen to their nonsense. There's no such thing." Then she turned around and lectured, "Dekhang, Shirbao, Endi, look at what you've done. Hurry and apologize to your eldest uncle. Second brother's wife, third brother's wife, and fourth brother's wife, keep a good eye on these little brats from now on. If they come out to cause trouble again, see if I don't break their legs." "Yes, yes, yes," everyone answered submissively. "Aunt, I hope that this is the last time. If I hear or see anyone bully my father again, this will be the consequence." Old Madame Chu was quite tactful. She was indeed someone who had lived in a mansion for so many years. Chu Qingyan also stopped beating around the bush and looked at old Madame Chu with a serious expression. "Don't worry, this kind of thing won't happen again." Old Madame Chu promised again. Once was already enough to cause a ruckus. If it happened again, old Madame Chu's entire family would probably be turned upside down. "I hope so." Chu Qingyan leisurely retracted her left foot that was dangling on the surface of the lake, and then left leisurely. She left behind the Chu family's pale faces. This slap was really loud, but they could only suffer in silence and swallow it alone. Chapter 25. The matter of Chu Qingyan causing a ruckus in the Chu family had reached Xiao Su's ears in less than the time it took for a stick of incense to burn. When the person who was resting with her eyes closed heard her subordinate's shocked description, she couldn't help opening her eyes, revealing a pair of beautiful eyes. Her voice carried a hint of surprise. "She used jumping into the lake to force them?" "That's right." This subordinate thought that the Chu family's young miss was scared silly, but who knew that the ones who were scared silly were the Chu family's people? This time, one of Huo Ling's subordinates came in to report. At this time, he had a slight look of worship on his face. It was really hard to imagine that a 10-year-old little girl would have such courage. It wasn't hard for Xiao Su to guess what had happened, but he never thought that there would be a day when his subordinate who had always been arrogant would praise someone. He curled his lips slightly. It seemed that this little girl was indeed not to be underestimated. He had seen how meticulous she was in Mao Village, and now he had heard of how bold and resourceful she was. He couldn't help but feel slightly gratified. "Lord, Lady Water Spirit sent a secret letter just now." At this time, a subordinate came in with a letter in his hand. Xiao Su restrained the emotions on his face. He took the letter and opened it. After reading 10 lines, his lips slightly curled. "Lord, did something happen?" Seeing Lord's face turn cold, the subordinate couldn't help but ask. Xiao Su closed the letter in his hand. Not long after, he opened his fingers and the paper fell to the ground like dust. "There's been a change in the marriage between this king and Chu Qingyan." His voice was cold and the temperature in the warm room dropped, making it seem like it was winter. Everyone looked at each other in dismay, not daring to say anything. Xiao Su stood with his hands behind his back, his face like ice, but no one knew that his heart had turned cold. In the end, Imperial Father had abandoned him again and again for that person. No, he could accept it if he abandoned him, but he couldn't accept it when his bottom line was repeatedly violated. Today, he had caused a ruckus in the Chu family, purposely showing off his might. He would be able to live peacefully for a while. Chu Qingyan's lips curved into a smile as she thought of this. However, she did not know that some predestined arrangements had quietly arrived. She pushed open the door to her parents' room, passed through the outer room, pulled open the door curtain, and entered the inner room. At a glance, she saw her father half sitting on the bed, wrapped up like a bear. At this moment, her father was acting spoiled and bargaining with her mother. When he saw his daughter come in, he happily greeted her. Kai Kai, you're back. Chu Machen's father, who had just been cheering, sneezed loudly. Chu Machen's mother immediately put down the ginger soup and reached out to cover the quilt that Chu Machen's father was trying to break free from. She said with a stern face, "Don't move. You'll catch a cold again." Looking at her father's red nose, Chu Qingyan felt sour in her heart. She immediately held her father's hands and blamed herself. "Father, it's daughter's fault. I didn't protect you well." Chu Machen's father was very innocent sometimes, but there was also a kind of childish seriousness sometimes. He raised his hand and patted his daughter's head. Instead of his usual playful expression, he looked a little proud. Kai, you're very good. Father is fine. You don't know. At that time, father deliberately flopped in the water. Father knows how to swim, but I just wanted them to be afraid. As soon as he finished speaking, Chu Qingyan and Chu Machen's mother were stunned. When did her father become so smart? He even knew how to take advantage of the situation and counterattack. However, what Chu Machen's father said next shattered their surprise and joy. I wanted to scare them away so that I could look for the treasure. Unfortunately, those people ignored me and actually stayed by the lake. How disappointing. Chu Machen's father looked regretful. Chu Qingyan's mouth twitched. How could her father be so silly and cute? In the end, Chu Machen's father blinked his watery eyes and drank the ginger soup like a warrior wringing his wrist. He obediently covered himself with the quilt and went to sleep. Seeing her mother's tired face, Chu Qingyan could not help but urge her to rest. However, at this moment, the quiet backyard suddenly became noisy. Chu Qingyan frowned. How could she let her father rest in such a noisy place? Chu Qingyan was about to go out to see what was going on. Before she reached the door was pushed open and Shan Cha hurried in. When she saw Chu Qingyan, her eyes lit up and she immediately pulled her out. "Ninth young mistress, someone from the palace is here to deliver an imperial edict. Old madam wants you to hurry to the front yard to receive the edict." Chu Qingyan wanted to shake off Shan Cha's hand, but stopped when she heard her words. From the palace? An imperial edict? Could it be that they were here to cancel the engagement? Chu Qingyan's eyes lit up and she quickened her pace. Shan Cha was originally dragging her, but now she was being dragged forward. Chu Qingyan could not be blamed for thinking this way. It was because she was still young and could not marry the King of England so quickly. Therefore, she guessed that this imperial edict was sent by the higher-ups because they felt that she was not worthy of the wise and mighty King of England. Or perhaps they could not bear to harm such a young seedling like her, so they sent someone to cancel the engagement. However, the most unpredictable thing in this world was an accident. However, accidents always like to happen silently. For example, at this moment, Chu Qingyan stepped into the main yard hurriedly and looked inside. Everyone was here. She looked up and saw Old Master Chu and Old Madam Chu talking carefully with a person dressed as a eunuch. The Chu family members were smiling so hard that their faces were almost stiff. Chu Qingyan could not help but twitch her mouth. This was indeed a shameless family. It was really unfortunate of 3 lifetimes to become relatives with these people. Madame Wang's eyes were sharp. When she saw her enter, she immediately exclaimed, "Our Qingyan is here." Chu Qingyan was disgusted by Madame Wang's way of addressing her, but now was the time to listen to business. The person who came to announce the imperial edict was none other than the favorite of the Sichuan emperor, Eunuch Chao. He casually glanced at Chu Qingyan, who was kneeling on the ground, then opened the imperial edict and read it aloud. "By the will of heaven, the emperor decrees, I have heard that the good daughter of the Chu family, Chu Qingyan, is of good character and appearance, intelligent and dignified, and is worthy of the King of England. I am greatly relieved, but I am worried. Chu Qingyan is still young and needs to get used to the King of England. She can move to the King of England's residence and wait for the wedding date to be completed. This imperial edict was like a bolt from the blue, quickly falling on top of Chu Qingyan's head. Chu Qingyan was instantly dumbfounded. To put it bluntly, the Sichuan emperor was afraid that his daughter-in-law would run away, so he wanted her to move to the King of England's residence and wait for the wedding to take place. In contrast to Chu Qingyan's stupor, the Chu family members looked at each other in dismay. They really could not figure out the true meaning of the Sichuan emperor's imperial edict. They all looked at the dumbfounded Chu Qingyan. At this moment, eunuch Chao looked at Chu Qingyan impatiently. "Ninth young Miss Chu, why aren't you accepting the imperial edict?" Chu Qingyan was called back to her senses. She gritted her teeth and took the imperial edict with a look of grief and indignation. Why didn't anyone tell her that it was customary for a fiancé to move to her fiancé's residence before the wedding? This was clearly a trap. The dazzling imperial edict stung her eyes. Chapter 26. When Chu Qingyan received the imperial edict, eunuch Chao looked at her meaningfully, then left amidst the Chu family's urging. Chu Qingyan, who was still in shock, didn't recover from her shock at all, so she ignored eunuch Chao's meaningful gaze. In the hall, everyone was congratulating Chu Qingyan. The Chu family was also very awkward. They had thrown the hot potato of a marriage to Chu Qingyan, and now she was forced to move to the King of England's residence. Whatever happened at that time would have nothing to do with the Chu family. This should have been a joyous occasion, but some people felt uncomfortable. Although the King of England wasn't favored by the Sichuan emperor and had an extremely bad reputation, he was still a lord. Seeing Chu Qingyan become a phoenix from a sparrow flying on a branch, they felt a little upset. Chu Qingyan didn't know the twists and turns in these people's hearts. Her mind was still in a daze, and she didn't know how she returned to her room with the imperial edict. As soon as she stepped into the room, Mother Chu came up to her, her face full of sorrow and confusion. "Kai, Mother heard the servants' discussion just now. Does His Majesty really want you to move to the residence of the King of England, whose reputation is in a mess? What should we do?" After hearing the sincere concern, Chu Qingyan's scattered thoughts finally gathered. She turned to look at her mother, whose face was full of worry, and felt a burst of warmth in her heart. She smiled and said, "Mother, don't be so pessimistic. Isn't it just moving? Don't you have to marry in the future? There's no difference whether you move sooner or later. Besides, if you move now, you can adapt to your future life in advance. It's also a good thing." Chu Qingyan didn't have confidence in the Sichuan emperor's impromptu idea. Although she said she was comforting her mother, her heart calmed down a lot as she spoke, and her tone became more resolute towards the end. "It's just that I'm afraid that I won't be able to serve father and mother often in the future. Father and mother, you have to take good care of yourself in the future." Chu Qingyan's gaze passed over her mother's shoulder to look at her father, who was peacefully sleeping on the bed. Her gaze became gentle. Fortunately, she had established her power in the Chu family. In the short term, the Chu family would not dare to treat her parents unfairly. This made her feel slightly relieved. Mrs. Chu wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes and felt much more relieved. "Kai, Mother realized that you have changed since you were injured last time." "Changed?" Chu Qingyan cried out in her heart. Did her mother notice that something was wrong with her? Just as Chu Qingyan's forehead was covered in cold sweat, Mrs. Chu placed a hand on her head and sighed softly. "You've become more sensible. You handle things more appropriately than your parents." If it weren't for this bestowed marriage, Kai would have had a happier and more stable future. So she was thinking too much. Chu Qingyan sighed in relief and reached out to hug her mother. She rubbed her head against her mother's chest and said coquettishly, "Mother, I'm still a child. Don't always mention marriage. I'll be shy. Mrs. Chu chuckled and couldn't help but say, "You're really a mischievous spirit." The melancholy of parting in the room was washed away just like that. What was left was a faint warmth. Huo Ling, who was sitting on the roof, saw this scene and turned to ask a subordinate who had just returned from the prince's estate. "Does Lord know about this?" The subordinate nodded and then said seriously, "Lord is very angry about His Majesty's decision." Huo Ling nodded. "His Majesty's action of forcing a duck onto a perch is truly too much." The subordinate looked at his master with suspicion. If it was any other time, his master would already be furious. Why was he smiling so slyly today? "Master, you don't seem to be angry at all." Huo Ling didn't expect his subordinate to see through him so quickly. He coughed lightly. "I'm already angry." The subordinate nodded in half disbelief. Huo Ling rubbed his chin. If it was in the past, he would definitely be flustered and exasperated when he learned of His Majesty's decision. But after observing Chu Qingyan for a few days, he found that if this little girl followed Lord, it might not be a bad thing. Thinking of her heroic appearance when she jumped into the lake today, she might be able to stir up the King of England's estate in the future. That would be fun. No one knew how many people's lives would be changed after this imperial edict was issued. They only knew that after the imperial edict was issued, the entire capital was in an uproar. What? His Majesty actually wants the Chu family's 10-year-old girl to move to the King of England's estate. Isn't this too impatient? Passerby cried out in shock. Perhaps the one impatient isn't His Majesty, but rather the King of England. After all, he's almost 20 years old. The King of England should be worried about this. Passerby B mysteriously came over. It's rumored that the King of England is a jinx to his wife. That pitiful little girl from the Chu family, I wonder if she can live until the day of her marriage. Passerby C was an old man. He stroked his beard as he shook his head and sighed. 10-year-old little princess, how pitiful, lamentable, and laughable. The market was not optimistic about the little Princess Chu Qingyan, but no one dared to talk about it. After all, this was a matter of the royal family and a single careless word could cause them to be beheaded. Chu Qingyan did not know what the rumors were, but that did not mean Xiao Su did not know. As he listened to his subordinate's report, Xiao Su's face was calm and unreadable. "Lord, since His Majesty has issued such an imperial edict, tomorrow will be the 70th birthday of the Chu family's old master. Should we prepare a precious gift?" The steward of the prince's estate entered the door and bowed his head as he inquired. Originally, Lord had left these matters of reciprocity to them, but after all, this was a special occasion. After all, the Chu family's old master had suddenly become the grandfather of the King of England's future princess. Therefore, matters like the birthday still had to be reported carefully. Xiao Su just remembered this matter. He raised his eyebrows and recalled that the little girl had planned to take advantage of this day to escape from the Chu family. Unfortunately, with this imperial edict, it was likely that she would not be able to escape. "Prepare a generous gift, this prince will bring it over tomorrow." Xiao Su could not help but speak when he thought of that childish but grown-up voice. Everyone in the room raised their heads in surprise and looked in disbelief at the lord in the center. They could not be blamed for making a fuss over nothing. After following their lord for so many years, they had never seen him attend any banquets with congratulatory gifts. Even the high-ranking imperial uncles and important officials of the imperial court had not received any preferential treatment from him. Why would the lord personally attend a small birthday banquet today? This was completely out of the ordinary. Xiao Su saw everyone's stunned expressions and frowned, his domineering aura leaking out. Everyone immediately put away their astonished gazes and straightened their backs as they tried to convince themselves that this was very normal, not abnormal at all. After making this decision, Xiao Su was also somewhat puzzled as to why he had made this decision in the first place. However, this thought crossed his mind and he said it out loud. Chapter 27. As soon as the imperial edict was announced, it set off quite a storm in the capital. It became the topic of conversation after meals. Soon, it was time for the Chu clan's old master's birthday. Many people in the capital were curious about the young miss of the Chu family and attended the birthday banquet. Even those who didn't receive an invitation tried their best to get one. It was said that during those days, the servants of the Chu family made a lot of money. On the day of the birthday, the front gate of the Chu family was as busy as a marketplace. This was a grand occasion that the Chu family had never been able to achieve even in its heyday. Old Master Chu smiled so widely that his molars could be seen. He thought that his status in the capital had risen. The servants of the Chu family came and went with all kinds of pastries. They wished that they had an extra pair of hands or legs. The Chu family was very lively today. Madame Xing and the others immediately asked their children to take out their best clothes and dress them up to look elegant and classy. Because there were many high officials and nobles at the banquet this time, there was no lack of young talents and noble ladies. Therefore, the Chu family wanted to use this opportunity to select a few of their children who were of age. Compared to the bustling scene outside, the room in the backyard was relatively quiet. At this moment, Chu Qingyan was yawning with her chin on her hand. "Father, your shoes are on the wrong side up," she kindly reminded him. Hearing this, Father Chu looked down at his shoes. Indeed, something was wrong. He was playing the game of changing shoes with himself. Mother Chu handed a pink dress with 100 butterflies to her. "This was sent here by Aunt a few days ago. Try it on." Chu Qingyan looked at the color and couldn't help but twitch her eyes. Why was it pink? Although she was a little girl, her soul was 20 years old. She hadn't worn this color for more than 10 years. She felt like she was back in kindergarten. But when she looked up and saw her mother's expectant face, Chu Qingyan swallowed her words of rejection. Forget it. She had a little girl's face now. Just treat it as reliving her youth. After changing her clothes, Chu Qingyan walked out under her mother's joy and her father's dumbfounded gaze. Looking at herself in the mirror, Chu Qingyan couldn't help but sigh. Sure enough, clothes make the person. At first glance, she really was a lovable and beautiful doll. She raised her eyebrows. The person in the mirror had a look of indifference that didn't match her age. In the blink of an eye, she returned to her simple smile. Since this was the first time he appeared in front of everyone, he might as well put on a good show and fight for the benefits that his parents deserved. What happened in the Chu clan before could only be considered small skirmishes. The real battle might begin today. She was the Sichuan retired emperor's granddaughter-in-law, and the marriage was personally bestowed by the Sichuan emperor. There were many gossipy people outside who were very curious about her, but she had to perform well in order to win more opportunities for her future. As a result, the person in the mirror moved slightly, and the colorful butterflies on the hem of her dress seemed to be dancing. A sweet and sly expression appeared on her face. Prepare for the first battle. Walking from the backyard to the front hall, Chu Qingyan gradually felt the lively atmosphere. She smiled. Because of this marriage, the Chu clan seemed to have gained a lot of benefits, reputation, status. However, in Chu Qingyan's view, this was mutually beneficial. In the future, when she moved to the King of England's residence, her parents would need the protection of the Chu clan. After all, without the lips, the teeth would feel cold. As soon as she walked into the front courtyard, the sharp-eyed old Madame Chu saw her, or perhaps she was waiting for her to appear. "Madam Lin, didn't you just say that you wanted to see my little Jiu? Look, she's here." Old Madame Chu's voice wasn't loud, but those gossipy people immediately looked in the direction of old Madame Chu's gaze. They saw a beautiful girl wearing 100 butterflies dress slowly walking into the courtyard. Her white skin and lovely sweet smile made her seem like a jade girl by Master Guanin's side. What a quick-witted little girl. Yes. She looks so delicate. Whispers of praise sounded. When Chu Yunyu and Chu Yingyu, who were sitting not far away, heard this, their faces instantly darkened. Just now, they were enjoying the compliments of the crowd. Now, the target of everyone's praise was the country bumpkin they despised the most. How could they feel good? What's the use of looking good? Isn't she going to marry the King of England who everyone fears? Chu Yingyu muttered unhappily. Chu Yunyu nodded in agreement. That's right. She's dressed so shabbily. She's just a country bumpkin. Although the two of them spoke softly, their conversation still reached many people's ears. Many of the madams heard them and couldn't help but frown. This young lady from the Chu clan was so talkative. She was not presentable at all. They started to look down on Chu Qingyan as well. Even though they were from the same clan, their characters were almost the same. Chu Qingyan had also heard the conversation between the two of them, and she could clearly feel the disdain in everyone's eyes. She could not help but have the urge to smack them with a brick and wake them up. They were in public right now. Even if there were any internal conflicts, they would have to deal with outsiders first. Who would fight amongst themselves like them? They didn't bring their brains with them when they went out. No, it should be that they didn't even use their brains at home. However, Chu Qingyan's focus was not on these things now. Hello, Aunt. Hello, madams. Chu Qingyan raised an innocent smile and greeted them one by one. She was only a 10-year-old girl. She was cute and sensible. Compared to Chu Yunyu and Chu Yingyu, who liked to gossip, Chu Qingyan's image was immediately reversed. A woman on the left of old Madame Chu smiled at Chu Qingyan and turned to old Madame Chu. This ninth young lady is as smart and clever as the rumors say. Old Madame Chu is blessed to have such a granddaughter. Old Madame Chu, who was annoyed by the rude words she said to Chu Yunyu and Chu Yingyu, immediately calmed down. She even looked at Chu Qingyan with a little more joy in her eyes. She's still young and doesn't know anything. Thank you for your praise, Madam Lin. Qingyan, quickly thank Madam Lin. Chu Qingyan immediately bowed obediently and said shyly, Thank you, Madam Lin. Her voice was sweet and pleasant. As soon as she spoke, she immediately became the center of attention. Chu Qingyan listened to everyone's compliments. In fact, she knew very well that what they valued was not Chu Qingyan as a person, nor the Chu family, but the title of consort of the Sichuan King of England. However, Chu Qingyan still played the role of the obedient ninth young lady dutifully. This made old Madame Chu feel proud. Old Master Chu was also in a good mood when he saw this and happily chatted with the people who congratulated him. Just as the banquet was about to start and Chu Qingyan secretly yawned several times, the page boy outside stumbled in. His expression was as if he had seen a ghost in broad daylight. Old master, what's the matter? As the head of the family and the birthday star of this birthday banquet, old Master Chu was the first to speak, his tone displeased. Ing. Old Master Chu frowned. Master King of England is here, he finally finished speaking in one breath. The page boy looked up. Old Master Chu's eyes were straight and his lips were trembling helplessly. What was going on? Chapter 28. This announcement was not loud, but because old Master Chu was the birthday boy today, everyone lowered their voices and glanced over from time to time. At this time, their ears perked up and they all heard this shocking news. This King of England seemed to have not attended this kind of banquet for many years. The only banquets that occasionally appeared could only be royal family banquets. Why would he appear here today? Everyone turned their heads to look at the sky. Today, the sun did not rise from the west, and there was no red rain falling from the sky. Did they hear wrongly? They could not help but stretch out their fingers to dig their ears. As if to verify the news of the servant, a white brocade robe appeared at the gate of the front yard. In spring, the peonies were in full bloom, but under the snow-like figure, they suddenly lost their color. The person's robe brushed against the bluestone floor, passing through the layers of flowers. It was like a cool breeze, dispersing the hustle and bustle of the room. Chu Qingyan did not put her mind on the banquet at all. After greeting just now, she had a smile on her face and her mind was empty as she waited for the banquet to end. Therefore, when the servant announced, she did not notice at all. She was only keenly aware that the prying gazes on her body had suddenly disappeared. She was a little surprised. When she came back to her senses, she inadvertently followed everyone's gaze and saw a person step down from the top of the mountain like a snow lotus. His cold and extraordinary temperament was like an aloof immortal who stood aloof from the world. His white robe fluttered in the wind, drawing arc after arc in the air. It was so graceful that it seemed to bring up the mist of the sea of clouds, adding mystery, spirituality, and alienation. Because the Chu family did not expect that so many people would come to this banquet, they hurriedly placed the banquet in the front yard. Fortunately, the April sun was not very strong, but it made people feel more comfortable. Therefore, Chu Qingyan sat with her back to the light, looking at the person who came in the light. She could not see his face clearly, but the soft light plated the person with a furry halo. The jumping spots of light danced mischievously on his robe and hair. Chu Qingyan suddenly felt that this person seemed to be more dazzling than the sun on the horizon. Greetings to His Royal Highness. When he stood still in the middle of the courtyard, everyone came back to their senses and immediately knelt down to pay their respects. Chu Qingyan trembled with fear. Was it necessary to kneel so piously? But when Chu Qingyan saw the upper-class lady, who had been talking and laughing in front of her, kneeling with a pale face and trembling lips, she suddenly remembered something that she had forgotten. Her fiancé was a notorious demon. She sneakily lifted her head and saw that he was already standing in front of old Master Chu. It was only then that Chu Qingyan realized that he was wearing a mask that covered his entire face, from his forehead to his nose. Only his eyes could be seen. It was a pity that she could not see what those eyes looked like from her position. It turned out that what had dazzled her earlier was the reflection of the silver mask on his face. If it were any other day, Chu Qingyan would not have cared who the person was. However, things were different now. No matter how much she disliked this marriage, this person was going to be her future husband after all. What's more, he had a bad reputation. Thus, she was rather curious. Everyone, there's no need to be so polite. The cold voice was like the icicles on the edge of a cold winter pond. Everyone shivered and reacted half a beat later before quickly standing up. Chu Qingyan was a voice fetish. Hearing this voice, a phrase suddenly popped up in her mind for no reason. A peerless voice. Although this voice was very calm, so calm that it was almost cold, as a voice fetish, Chu Qingyan did not notice it at all. Her heart was filled with the feeling that it was like the sound of nature. Chu Qingyan did not know, but if her thoughts were known by the people present, they would probably bleed 3 liters of blood. For old Master Chu's birthday, this king has prepared a congratulatory gift. I hope old Master Chu will not dislike it. The cold voice sounded again. As soon as the voice fell, the congratulatory gift was delivered to old Master Chu by a servant behind him. Old Master Chu never dreamed that there would be a day when a prince would come to celebrate his birthday. Overwhelmed by the unexpected favor, he had the servant put it away properly. He hurriedly bowed and said, "It is this old man's good fortune that the King of England could come. You have also specially prepared a congratulatory gift." This old man really did not live in vain. Chu Qingyan inwardly clicked her tongue. She originally thought that this granduncle of hers was old-fashioned and speechless. She didn't expect that when it came to flattering, he was really outstanding. At this time, a bit of impatience flashed through the inky eyes under the silver mask. He replied, "In the future, we will be family. There is no need to be polite." When these words were said, everyone held their breaths, but the Chu family was overjoyed. It seemed that the King of England did not reject this marriage as much as the rumors said. They couldn't help but straighten their backs. "Did you see that? The King of England had publicly admitted that he would be the Chu family's backer in the future. Their Chu family would soon soar. If Chu Qingyan knew what they were thinking at this time, her worldview would probably be refreshed. She had seen shameless people, but she had never seen people who were so shameless. Yes, yes, yes. In the future, when Qingyan marries over, we will be family. Old Madame Chu echoed from the side, her face full of pride. Today's main character is Old Master Chu, so this king will not steal the limelight. After saying this, Xiao Su found a corner and sat down. This made Old Master Chu, who was about to arrange a seat for him, startled. He hurriedly sent a few servants over to serve him well, and then announced that the banquet would continue. Seeing that the King of England had taken a seat, everyone also took a seat, but the atmosphere had changed. It was not as unbridled and noisy as before. After all, there was a big Buddha sitting there, so everyone was a bit restless. And Chu Qingyan could feel everyone's mood. She couldn't help but look at the person who sat aside after giving the congratulatory gift. This kind of feeling was like stirring up a pool of water, and then carelessly watching from the side with his hands behind his back. His hair was tied up high by a jade crown and hung down behind him. Paired with the snow-white robe, it looked even darker. Clouds embroidered with golden threads split from the lapel to the two sides of the robe, sparkling under the sunlight. It really was like the clouds floating in the sky, giving people a kind of noble feeling. Perhaps she forgot to hide her gaze, but the person who lowered his head seemed to feel her gaze. When he raised his eyes, her gaze met his. Suddenly, the four beauties of the human world disappeared, and the temperature suddenly dropped. For the first time, Chu Qingyan felt what it was like to have a basin of ice water poured over her head, the feeling of a heart-penetrating cold. Now is the time. She couldn't see any warmth in that pair of beautiful eyes. They were like stars decorated with layers of ice crystals, more beautiful than agate and pearls, but for some reason, they made people feel cold. No wonder just now, no matter how attentive her uncle and aunt were, they didn't dare to look him in the eyes. And the people present also looked away in fear. It turned out that this person had an aura that made people afraid. As long as he didn't speak or move, he could completely make people break out in a cold sweat and feel fear from the bottom of their hearts. Cold-faced Yama, he really lived up to his reputation. Chapter 29. This person is very dangerous. This was Chu Qingyan's first impression of her future husband. No, he was also very handsome. Chu Qingyan's two senses flooded her mind. Perhaps to the world, the silver mask hid an ugly face, but she never saw a person's face at first glance. Although she had been caught peeking, Chu Qingyan did not panic. Instead, she gave him an extremely obedient smile, and then lowered her head to count the ears of wheat that were decorated with a jade pendant at her waist. Since it was the first time they met, she definitely wanted to leave a good impression, so it was always right to pretend to be obedient. Xiao Su raised his eyebrows. He did not expect her to be able to remain so calm under his undisguised gaze, and he could not help but feel a little surprised. There were so many people present, but the number of people who dared to look him in the eye could be counted on one hand. However, he remembered that when they were at the back mountain of Mao village, she had not been frightened at all even though he had been heavily drugged, so it was not surprising. It was best that she did not fear him. Otherwise, how would the two of them live together in these long years? Xiao Su calmly withdrew his gaze, and turned to the people who had been looking at the mask on his face with complicated gazes. They immediately lowered their heads like ostriches. Xiao Su slightly curved his lips, revealing a trace of ridicule. The Chu family, who had been trembling as they greeted everyone, felt the powerful aura of this great Buddha, and no one dared to breathe lightly. The banquet was coming to an end, and everyone had a feeling that they were about to escape from the sea of suffering. Some people just like to court death. At first, they were scared to death of the King of England, but now that the banquet was coming to an end, they were unwilling to let him leave just like that. Thus, old Madam Chu pinched old Master Chu beside her, and then pointed her mouth in the direction of Chu Qingyan and the King of England. Old Master Chu immediately understood, and then coughed twice, and then said to the already impatient King of England, "Your Highness, it's rare for you to grace us with your presence. Why don't you let Qingyan show you around the Chu family? At the same time, you can get to know each other better." What does the King of England think? As soon as these words were said, everyone present raised their heads from the dining table. They thought that the Chu family was just a small, run-down family, but they didn't expect that their behavior would be so unpresentable that they would actually let an unmarried girl accompany an outsider. Even if the marriage between Chu Qingyan and Xiao Su was set in stone, and His Majesty's golden words allowed Chu Qingyan to move to the King of England's residence, these were two different things. He couldn't wait to curry favor, and at this time, he said such words in front of so many people. Everyone revealed looks of disdain, and at the same time, they pitied Chu Qingyan for meeting such an ignorant elder. Originally, it was already unfortunate for her to be involved in this marriage. But there was still this. When Chu Qingyan heard old Master Chu's words, she was already holding her forehead helplessly. They were so eager to curry favor, but why did they still want her to take the blame in the first place? This family was really abnormal. When Xiao Su saw Chu Qingyan's disappointed expression, he couldn't help but curve his lips and said to old Master Chu, "Since old Master Chu has said so, then it would be impolite for this prince to refuse." Chu Qingyan covered her eyes. This person was really easy to talk to. But soon, she heard that cold voice again. "I heard that the eldest son of the Chu family is talented and intelligent. Why don't you walk together with me? This prince has a poem that he just composed, we can discuss it together." Unexpected disaster from the heavens. Chu Dekhang, who was sitting at the side, turned pale when he heard this. How was he talented and intelligent? He didn't want to be with this evil prince. What if he was unhappy and cut him with a knife? What should he do then? But from the Chu family's point of view, although the King of England was cold-blooded and heartless, at least he had come to congratulate them today. Moreover, there were so many guests, so they thought that he wouldn't cause any trouble. Besides, it wasn't a bad thing to gain the appreciation of the Lord, so Chu Dekhang was urged by the crowd to follow the two people walking forward. With Chu Dekhang accompanying them, it was no longer a case of a man and a woman alone together. Chu Qingyan couldn't help but raise her head to look at the man striding ahead. Was he trying to save her reputation just now? As if he had eyes on the back of his head, Xiao Su turned around in an instant and met Chu Qingyan's gaze again. But this time, his eyes didn't seem to be covered with a thick layer of frost. Instead, they were somewhat clear. "Don't dawdle." It was still cold. Chu Qingyan was startled. Looking at a certain person who turned around and continued walking, she couldn't help but pat her head. Was she caught in the door just now? Otherwise, why would she feel that this person's personality had changed? "Okay, I'm coming." Chu Qingyan didn't care about her ladylike demeanor. Lifting her skirt, she trotted after him. If she continued to walk with small, quick steps, she was afraid that she would be left behind and lose sight of him. She didn't know where the person in front of her was going. Although she had been in the Chu family for a while, she had never been on this road before. He was walking so fast, what if the two of them got lost? Chu Dekhang, who had a dejected look on his face, slowly followed behind. His face was filled with fear, as if he was afraid that he would be called over by this elusive King Ying. Suddenly, the two people in front of him stopped him. Looking at their clothes, they were the followers of the King of England. "His Highness has said that as long as young Master Chu stays here, you will be safe and sound. If you take another step forward, no one can guarantee your safety." A black-clothed guard flashed his small white teeth and said in a serious tone. "Yes, yes, yes." Chu Dekhang acted as if he had been granted amnesty. He immediately retreated to the shade of a tree and didn't dare to walk forward. "Really can't be seen in public." just this little bit of courage. The other black-clothed guard looked at the relieved Chu Dekhang and said in disdain. They looked down on this kind of weak and cowardly person the most. Who cares, as long as it doesn't affect the lord and the young princess date, he can do anything. The black-clothed guard from before said with a smile. He curiously peeked behind, but the two of them had already walked far away and were hidden behind layers of green barriers. It's a pity that the Lord sent us away, causing us to be unable to see anything. The other black-clothed guard rolled his eyes. How do you know that the Lord and the Chu family's 9th young miss are on a date? Maybe His Highness is trying to warn her so that she will know her place. TSK, you don't understand. If that's the case, why would the Lord want that young Master Chu to accompany him? It's clearly to cover up, otherwise the young princess' reputation will be damaged. The black-clothed guard said confidently, as if he had guessed his master's thoughts. He had a complacent look on his face. The other black-clothed guard's face suddenly darkened. Finally, his face and clothes turned black. If it was night time, his entire person would have been invisible. Chapter 30. When the passing servants saw this person, they immediately hid far away in fear. Chu Qingyan sighed. Was the person in front of her really to the point of being repulsive? At this time, she looked around and saw that they were getting more and more remote. Her heart couldn't help but feel a touch of worry. This person didn't say a word. Where did he want to take her? She wasn't so stupid that she couldn't see that he had sent Chu Dekhang away, let alone believe that this person had the leisure to stroll around the Chu family. However, this person seemed to be surrounded by a block of ice, emitting a cold air that isolated the touch of others. So, although she wanted to open her mouth to ask, she didn't have the courage. She was afraid that the other person would be unhappy and break her neck. After all, her arms and legs were small and her neck was thin. She couldn't withstand this kind of destruction. Xiao Su, who was strolling in front, found that the footsteps behind him seemed to be a bit far away. He couldn't help but stop and turn around. However, he saw the little one holding her skirt and trotting after him. Unfortunately, his pace was too fast for her to catch up. Xiao Su saw that the little one, who was always calm and steady, was in a hurry and couldn't help but feel a little happy. So, he kindly stood under an unknown tall tree and waited for her. It couldn't be blamed for Xiao Su calling Chu Qingyan a little one. Although Chu Qingyan grew up in Mao village and did a lot of rough work, climbing mountains and wading through rivers was not a problem. Although she was young, compared to the girls of the same age who were raised in the boudoir, her figure was already outstanding. However, when she stood in front of Xiao Su, she only reached his chest. Xiao Su always had to lower his head to look at her. Moreover, Chu Qingyan's face was petite, so in Xiao Su's eyes, she was just a little one. When Chu Qingyan trotted all the way and saw the white silk, she breathed a sigh of relief. When she stood still, she suddenly realized that something was wrong. She instantly raised her head and saw that the tall figure was dragged by the sunlight and fell at her feet. Qian Qian's gaze was like the ripples on the blue waves in winter, beautiful yet cold. It was clearly a warm spring day, but Chu Qingyan shivered. However, she seemed to have seen a strange light flash past. Was it a smile? However, just as he was about to take a closer look, the other party's gaze had already swept past him and turned to the pond under the bridge. After that, he did not say a word. No words. Chu Qingyan was stunned. Was he going to play a pantomime with her? Your Highness, are you tired? Do you want to sit in the pavilion over there? Although Chu Qingyan didn't want to pay attention to him, he was still a guest. Moreover, she might need this person's help for the rest of her life. Therefore, Chu Qingyan racked her brains and finally found a sentence that sounded good. When Xiao Su heard this, he retracted his gaze and looked at her again. It was normal for an army to travel hundreds of kilometers in a day. How could she be tired because of such a small distance? The person who was tired should be her. A woman's physical strength was weaker than a man's, not to mention that she was still young. Xiao Su saw that her forehead was covered in sweat, but she was pretending to be relaxed as she looked at him. Xiao Su felt that this little thing was really quite cute. He didn't think that she would take the initiative to speak. No matter how noble a person's status was, they would still respond out of respect. It was a pity that this person really exceeded the level of normal people's understanding. He only looked at her, but did not reply. This almost made Chu Qingyan think that a flower had bloomed on her face, which was why the other party was so focused that he ignored her question. Although the other party was not cooperative, she couldn't continue to stare at each other like this. This is our first meeting. If Qingyan has not received you well, I hope that your highness will be magnanimous enough to forgive me. Chu Qingyan could only continue to be polite. First meeting. Xiao Su couldn't help but curve his lips slightly. Including this time, he had already seen her 3 times. The other party didn't seem to have any intention to speak and his gaze became a little strange. Chu Qingyan broke out in cold sweat. It seemed that something had pleased him. She felt that it was very strange. She clearly didn't do anything. Just as Chu Qingyan continued to rack her brains, the cold-faced Yama finally opened his mouth. You, 10 years old? Yes. This person didn't open his mouth, but when he did, it was shocking. Although Chu Qingyan was caught off guard by him, she still answered first out of conditioned reflex. He already knew the answer, but after personally confirming it, Xiao Su still frowned. Chu Qingyan was well behaved while secretly observing the other party. Seeing a trace of displeasure in his eyes, she immediately lowered her head and couldn't help but sigh. She had long guessed that if this King of England knew her age, he would definitely be unhappy. Although there was a saying in modern times, that men were very loyal. When they were young, they liked women younger than them. When they were successful in their career, they liked women younger than them. When they entered middle age, they liked women younger than them. If it was anyone else, even when their hair was white, they would still like women younger than them. In fact, men were very loyal in their lives and liked women younger than them. But the situation now was not quite the same. If it was any other man, he wouldn't want to marry a woman who was still a child. Just like her and Xiao Su. Thinking about it, when the imperial edict was issued, this person was forced to accept it. Thus, Chu Qingyan could not help but shut her mouth obediently. She thought that her looks were passable, but she knew that no man would be interested in a 10-year-old like her. Thus, in order to avoid being the target of his anger, she decided to stay quiet and be a beautiful lady. A beautiful doll. Seeing the change in Chu Qingyan's expression, Xiao Su knew that she had misunderstood something. But he had never been a person who liked to explain, so he stood under the tree with his hands behind his back and threw out a piece of news that made the beautiful baby break her silence. Go back and pack up today. Someone will come to pick you up tomorrow. Pick me up. Chu Qingyan was immediately stunned. Father has already issued an imperial edict to let you move to the King of England's residence. Since there's no time like the present, then tomorrow it will be. Xiao Su hated repeating the same thing the most, but Chu Qingyan's thunderous expression pleased him, so he didn't mind letting her suffer another bolt of lightning. Unfortunately, the other party had already flung his sleeves and left. She couldn't catch up with him at all. So after digesting the news, Chu Qingyan had already given up on chasing him. So, in Chu Qingyan's impression, this fiancé had only said 3 things to her. The first sentence, he was displeased with her age. The second sentence, he ordered her to move. The third, he was displeased with her intelligence. Chu Qingyan blushed with shame. This ghostface Yama seemed to be really difficult to get along with. Chapter 31. Returning to the King of England's manor, Xiao Su had just sat down when a black shadow appeared in front of him. Greetings, master. After the black shadow appeared, he immediately knelt in salute. Xiao Su raised an eyebrow and looked at his travel-worn subordinate. He gathered his sleeves and said, "Stand up." When Hualing saw the person who came, he immediately raised his hair. "Turan, weren't you still at Qinling Mountain a few days ago? Why did you come back so quickly? If I didn't come back, the consequences would have been irreversible." The person called Turan looked at Hualing with a mocking gaze. Normally, these two people didn't see eye to eye and would quarrel as soon as they met. Xiao Su had already been drinking tea. He calmly picked up the teacup lid and lightly tapped the cup. "What irreversible? Are you scolding me indirectly again?" Hualing heard the confrontation in his words and instantly exploded. He was on the verge of exploding. As long as the other side dared to say yes, he wouldn't be polite. Turan looked at him with disdain and didn't want to argue with him anymore. He immediately turned to face his master with a solemn expression. "Master, His Majesty forced this marriage on you. Why didn't you resist? You clearly know that as long as this marriage is confirmed, your status in Sichuan will." Turan looked at his master who had a heavy expression and found it hard to continue. He hatefully said, "Lord, you have repeatedly given in, but they have never been satisfied. Will the Lord continue to endure? You should know which is more important for the position of Princess Consort. Could it be that you want this prince to resist the decree?" Xiao Su didn't become angry because of his subordinate's words and calmly asked. "There's no need to resist the decree. Let this subordinate take care of that Chu family's young miss for you. Then this marriage won't happen without a bride." Turan revealed a bloodthirsty sneer. "Unfortunately, nonsense." Xiao Su slammed his teacup down with a loud bang. His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make everyone lower their heads in fear. Even Earth's spirit couldn't help but kneel down. He bit his lips and stubbornly looked up at his master in front of him. "Master, your subordinate isn't fooling around. It's just that I can't continue to watch you." "Shut up. Since when did I allow you to question my affairs?" Xiao Su looked at him coldly. "Turan, don't forget your identity." Turan lowered his head and gritted his teeth. "I don't dare. This marriage is already set in stone. Even without the Chu clan, there will be the Li clan, the Lin clan, and the Qin clan. Thus, this prince will not permit any of you to complicate matters." Xiao Su swept his gaze over the crowd and spoke in an unquestionable tone. Then, he flicked his sleeves and left. Turan and Hualing not only heard the toughness in these words, but also felt a touch of sadness. Yes, even if they destroyed the Chu clan, Sichuan emperor would have other candidates. Their hearts were filled with desolation. For Chu Qingyan, the most bewildering thing wasn't that she was about to move to the King of England's estate, but that she would have to live together with His Royal Highness, whose emotions were hard to discern. Although the other party's temperament was cold and his voice was moving, it was also very cold. Sob sob, Chu Qingyan had the urge to cry, but no tears came out. "Kai Kai, is it very difficult for you?" After Chu Mu's mother received the news, compared to the Chu clan's relieved sighs of relief, Chu Mu's mother's chest tightened, and she was full of worry for her daughter. Chu Qingyan didn't expect that she would reveal her emotions so quickly. She immediately put away her emotions and pretended to be relaxed. "Mother, don't worry. Your daughter is so smart and cute. I will definitely live comfortably in the King of England's estate. As long as you and father live well in the Chu clan, your daughter will be even more at ease." Only then did Chu Mu's mother reveal a smile. She looked at her husband, whose eyes were wide open as he watched the mother and daughter talk. She gently patted her daughter's hand. "Kai Kai, don't worry. Mother will take good care of your father. Come, mother will help you pack your things." Chu Qingyan propped her cheeks with both hands while her mother helped her pack her clothes. Actually, there wasn't much to take away, but she didn't want to hurt her mother's concern for her. Perhaps if she could do something for her now, her mother wouldn't feel so bad. At this moment, Chu Mu's father came over with an aggrieved expression. "Kai Kai, where are you going?" Hearing this, Chu Qingyan remembered that her father didn't know that she was moving to the Chu clan. She couldn't help but turn to face him and reply with a serious expression, "Father, I'm moving to another place. I might not be able to see you often. You have to listen to mother and not make her angry. If someone bullies you, don't be impulsive. Save it up and wait for your daughter to come back to avenge you." Chu Mu's father smiled and nodded. Then, he felt that something was wrong. He tugged at Chu Qingyan's sleeve pitifully and asked, "Can't you bring father and Danyang with you? Father doesn't want to be separated from you." Chu Qingyan originally thought that she had convinced her father, but she didn't expect him to only react now. Seeing her father's innocent and aggrieved expression, she couldn't help but sigh softly. She said apologetically, "Father, I can't make the decision on this matter. After all, that place isn't our territory. But I promise that if I have the ability one day, I will definitely bring you and mother over to live together." But would that day really come? Chu Qingyan wasn't sure. "Kai Kai, are you going to live with that bad guy?" Chu Mu's father suddenly asked. Ever since he heard the rumors from the servants, her father had already labeled the King of England as a heinous villain. Chu Qingyan thought back to that slender figure walking over with his back against the light. Heinous beyond redemption? She couldn't tell, but he made people feel fearful for no reason. Chu Qingyan nodded. "Then father will be your bodyguard. I won't let him bully you," Chu Mu's father said seriously. Chu Qingyan giggled. "Father, Kai Kai can protect herself. You just have to protect mother well." Chu Mu's father was fooled by his daughter. He scratched his head in embarrassment and laughed foolishly. "Kai Kai is so smart. She can protect herself well." But as soon as he finished speaking, her father turned and ran away. Chu Qingyan had long been fascinated by her father's actions. In the blink of an eye, her father ran back with a wooden stick in his hand. "Kai Kai, this is for you to protect yourself. If anyone dares to bully you, hit them with this stick." "Okay." Chu Qingyan's face shone with a holy radiance as she took the wooden stick that her father handed to her so solemnly. That was what he said, but was it really okay? The answer was no. Chu Qingyan was actually against the idea of the King of England sending people to pick her up. But this day would come. See, it came. Chu Qingyan looked at the two bodyguards who were led to her by the servants. She recognized these two people. They had accompanied the King of England to attend the birthday banquet. "Ninth young mistress, it's time to hit the road." "Hit the road? What road?" "The road of death." Chu Qingyan's head started to swell. Chapter 32. Chu Qingyan didn't actually have a lot of things, only 2 small bags. But when she saw one of the guards carrying the bags in his hands, as if he was carrying 2 newborn chicks, Chu Qingyan suddenly had a feeling of empathy. The Chu family members pretended to rub their eyes, but were actually cheering with joy. Chu Qingyan stepped onto the carriage prepared by the King of England's residence. She lifted the curtain and looked at her parents' teary eyes. Her heart was filled with a strong sense of reluctance. Suddenly, she had an idea. If there was an opportunity in the future, she must ask the King of England for special privileges, to see if she could come back to see her parents more often. In the midst of the sound of the carriage wheels, Chu Qingyan leaned against the wall of the carriage and slowly sorted out her thoughts. The 2 guards who came to pick her up were a pair of twins. The one with a face that looked like someone owed him 1,000,000 taels was the older brother, called Gu Rong. The one with a smile on his face was the younger brother, called Gu Yi. Perhaps it was because she was still young that other people simply disdained to hide their thoughts. These 2 people were like the black and white devils. One of them was hostile towards her with disdain, while the other was smiling at her with cold eyes. Chu Qingyan knew that many people would not be satisfied with this marriage. Even she couldn't accept it. Not to mention these people who had been by her lord's side all year round. Based on their sunshine, they would look down on her. At the very least, they wouldn't be a match for her. However, Chu Qingyan hooked up her lips. So what? This marriage was personally bestowed by the retired emperor and personally written by the Sichuan emperor. It was a done deal. Even if they were secretly dissatisfied, they wouldn't dare to do anything to her on the surface. Anyway, she had made up her mind. After entering the King of England's residence, she would just be a rice worm and wouldn't get in anyone's way. She would just treat it as entering her retirement period in advance. However, although her dreams were plentiful, the reality was always very harsh. Chu Qingyan would never have dreamed that from the moment she entered the King of England's residence, she was destined to work hard and not have a peaceful life. The King of England's mansion. These 3 words were engraved on the plaque. Perhaps it was because the King of England had been on the battlefield, but Chu Qingyan felt that these words carried a murderous aura. She immediately lowered her head and walked in obediently. The moment he stepped through the gate, it was as if he had walked into the early winter from the warm spring. Solemn, cold, and cheerless, like a cold wind blowing in his face. Chu Qingyan unconsciously tightened her collar. She couldn't help but think of the silver-masked King of England. No wonder he was always so cold. He lived in such a deserted place. How could he not be affected by the cold air? However, although the prince's mansion gave off a cold feeling, its layout made Chu Qingyan, who was a modern person, gasp. It was indeed a place where the nobles lived. The Middle Road Manor was majestic and spectacular. Just by looking at a corner of the prince's mansion, one could already feel the rich heritage. The layout was unique and magnificent, and the scenery was unique and splendid. Gu Rong and Gu Yi led her through many twists and turns before finally arriving at a courtyard. They then handed her over to a man in his 40s or 50s who was decently dressed. Gu Yi smiled and bowed to her before turning to leave. Gu Rong left without even looking at her, as if she was some kind of virus. His disdain for her was very obvious. However, Chu Qingyan didn't care at all. She smiled shyly and looked at the middle-aged man in front of her. Gu Yi just said that this man was the butler of the King of England's mansion. It seemed that her food and drink in the future was in the hands of this man. She had to perform well. 9th young lady is very polite. This old servant is the butler of the prince's mansion, White Tiger. Today, the lord asked this old servant to arrange a place for 9th young lady. Please follow this old servant. White Tiger's words were respectful, but his eyes flashed a touch of contempt. Thank you for your trouble, butler. Bye. Chu Qingyan looked innocent. White Tiger glanced at her and walked in a direction. Chu Qingyan obediently followed behind him. At this time, she also noticed that a little maid was following behind them. She was holding the bag that Gu Yi had helped her carry. She blinked and then focused her attention on the road in front of her. After walking for half an incense stick's worth of time, they walked further and further away. When White Tiger stopped, Chu Qingyan looked around the environment. There were few people, like an abandoned corner. White Tiger said with a fake smile, 9th young lady, this is where you will live in the future. Chu Qingyan deliberately frowned in disgust, as if she had been wronged. White Tiger expected that she would have such thoughts. He couldn't help but say, 9th young lady, I think you also know that this marriage was bestowed by His Majesty. The Lord can't decide, but the Lord can decide how to treat you. The Lord has always liked peace and quiet and doesn't want to be disturbed by unimportant people. So I hope that 9th young lady can abide by your duties and don't make the Lord unhappy. This old servant can only remind you of this. Sure enough, it was a show of strength, just as Chu Qingyan expected. These words could only fool a 10-year-old child. Chu Qingyan sneered in her heart, but she didn't let White Tiger down. She immediately showed a fearful look and agreed submissively. Only then did White Tiger nod his head in satisfaction, and then he pointed at the little servant girl that was following behind them. This is the servant girl that the inner court assigned to ninth young lady. Shi Ning, come and greet ninth young lady. The little servant girl walked out. Shi Ning greets ninth young lady. A half-grown child, perhaps only 1 or 2 years older than her. Chu Qingyan revealed a thought-provoking smile. Letting a child take care of another child, wasn't this deliberately making things difficult? However, she accepted this challenge. White Tiger intentionally or unintentionally knocked Chu Qingyan a few more times, found that she was naive and ignorant, then left in relief. After finally sending away this smiling tiger, Chu Qingyan rubbed her stiff face, then turned and looked at the little servant girl in front of her. Miss Jiu, you're so beautiful. You look like a porcelain doll. You're so cute. Shi Ning rolled her eyes and looked very smart. Chu Qingyan smiled at her, a child who hadn't grown up yet. Her heart was still relatively simple, otherwise no one would praise their master like a fragile porcelain. But seeing that she really liked her, Chu Qingyan also replied, you are also very cute. Being praised by her new master made Shi Ning very happy, and she couldn't wait to raise her little tail. Master, you are so good. Chu Qingyan couldn't help but smile. It seemed that the King of England's residence was really like White Tiger, treating her as an insignificant person, otherwise they wouldn't have arranged such a young servant girl with no shrewdness to serve her. Perhaps this King of England wanted the two of them to live a life of not contacting each other. But this was also what she wanted, at least she wouldn't be watched all day long, and could live more freely. This time when she left the Chu residence, she didn't bring Shan Cha with her, because she wouldn't easily trust a person who had betrayed her once, no matter how loyal they were to her afterwards. Rather than having a person who had stabbed her by her side, it was better not to bring her, to avoid future troubles. Then let's tidy up the courtyard. Chu Qingyan smiled and rolled up her sleeves. And just as Chu Qingyan was tidying up her courtyard, Xiao Su returned to the prince's residence. Chapter 33. When Xiao Su returned to the mansion, the head maid Hong Yi greeted him, Lord. After softly greeting him, she took the cloak that Xiao Su took off and turned to put it on the shelf. What happened in the mansion today? Xiao Su asked faintly after taking a seat in the chair. Hong Yi thought for a moment, then smiled and shook her head, everything in the mansion is fine, nothing major. After answering, Hong Yi saw Lord slightly raised his eyebrows, and she couldn't help but wonder. Usually, she never saw Lord care about the mansion's affairs. Why did he suddenly ask about it today? At this moment, a little maid appeared at the door and motioned to her. Hong Yi looked at Lord and saw that he didn't pay attention to her movements, so she went out. What's the matter? Hong Yi walked to the end of the corridor, and the little maid followed her. She turned around and looked at the little maid. If she remembered correctly, this little maid was a servant of housekeeper Bai. The little maid immediately replied, Housekeeper Bai asked this servant to tell Sister Hong that Chu family's 9th miss has been settled, and there's no need for Sister Hong to worry. Only then did Hong Yi remember that today was the day the 9th young miss of the Chu clan would be marrying into the estate. Perhaps it was because the Yin King's estate did not place much importance on this marriage, so they had inadvertently overlooked this matter. Where did housekeeper Bai arrange Chu family's 9th miss? Hong Yi couldn't help but ask. The winding path leads to the secluded courtyard. The little maid replied. Hong Yi waved the little maid away and thought carefully about this matter. The winding path leads to the secluded courtyard, which was the courtyard farthest from the main courtyard. She thought about it again, was this what the master asked just now? She turned back to the room and slightly bowed to the person on the main seat, Lord, housekeeper Bai just sent someone to report that Chu family's 9th miss has been settled. The bookkeeper paused for a moment. His gaze moved away from the book and landed on the person in front of him. Where is it arranged? Hong Yi immediately reported the name of the little maidservant. She carefully observed the Lord's expression, but she couldn't see any change. She couldn't help but wonder, could it be that the Lord ordered housekeeper Bai to arrange it? At this time, the maid Huang Yi, who was dressed in yellow, walked in. She bowed to Xiao Su and said, "Lord, it's time for dinner. Do you want to serve dinner?" Xiao Su replied indifferently. Therefore, Huang Yi stood aside while Huang Yi returned to the kitchen and ordered the servants to serve dinner. Xiao Su sat down at the dinner table. Just as he picked up the chopsticks, he suddenly paused and put down the chopsticks. There was no emotion in his tone. "Invite Chu family's 9th miss to come and have dinner together." Huang Yi thought that the matter of Chu family's 9th miss was over. She didn't expect that the Lord would mention it at this time. She immediately responded and ordered the servants to summon her. She couldn't help but be anxious. The winding path leads to the secluded courtyard and the main courtyard were in the south and north. She hoped that the servants would hurry up and not delay the Lord's dinner. In the courtyard where the winding path leads to the secluded courtyard. By the time Chu Qingyan and Xi Ning finished cleaning up the entire courtyard, they were so tired that they were about to collapse. The messy courtyard was obviously uninhabited for a long time. Housekeeper Bai arranged her here, clearly saying that she was sent to the cold courtyard and should know her place. Otherwise, the result, however, Chu Qingyan was happy to be at ease. She didn't have to face the deceitful life in the backyard. She was willing to be a rice worm. But this rice worm seemed to be starving to death. "Xining, when do you usually eat?" Chu Qingyan asked with a bitter face. Xining heard the words and put down the quilt in her hand. She thought for a moment, "It seems to be this time now. However, our courtyard is far from the kitchen. It will take half an hour to go back and forth." Chu Qingyan choked on blood in her chest. "My God, it's so far away. It's so difficult to eat a meal." Xining looked at her master's wrinkled and aggrieved appearance and couldn't help but laugh. "Master, wait a moment. This servant will bring you the meal now." Chu Qingyan touched her hungry stomach. When she was about to nod, a servant knocked on the courtyard door and then passed an order. The ghost-faced lord invited her to eat. As soon as she heard this news, Chu Qingyan's heart became cold. Wouldn't it be a hongmen banquet? Guessing was one thing, but seeing the impatient expression on the servant's face, Chu Qingyan knew that she couldn't put on airs since she was new here. She immediately brought Xi Ning along with her. Chu Qingyan didn't expect that the rice worm idea that just came up would be strangled in the bud. She suddenly wanted to cry but had no tears. After walking for a while, Chu Qingyan realized how far her courtyard was from the King of England's courtyard. Her feet were almost broken from walking. She couldn't be blamed for being delicate, but this body was still a 10-year-old child. Her legs were not long and her strength was not enough. Hurrying, they finally arrived at the main courtyard. Without looking at the layout of the buildings here, Chu Qingyan was taken all the way into a spacious room. Along the way, her stomach was already rumbling with hunger and her eyes were blurred. The moment she saw fragrant and delicious dishes, Chu Qingyan's eyes lit up. The moment Chu Qingyan entered the courtyard, Xiao Su had already sensed it. However, he didn't expect her to come in like this, drooling over the food in front of him. Reporting to the Lord, 9th Miss Chu has arrived. Hong Yi's voice instantly snapped Chu Qingyan out of her daze. She thought that she had not revealed anything, so she retracted the expression on her face. Then, she put on a naive and innocent expression as she smiled and greeted the person seated. Qingyan pays her respects to His Highness in King. Anyone who saw Chu Qingyan's cute smile would soften their hearts. Even Hong Yi felt that this 9th Miss Chu had a lovable appearance, but Xiao Su didn't buy it. Have a seat." Xiao Su didn't even look at her and picked up his chopsticks. So cold. Then why did he call her over? Chu Qingyan cursed in her heart, but still sat down obediently and took the chopsticks from the servant. She was hungry, but she didn't dare to eat. Following such a powerful moving ice cube, she was almost frozen to death. How could she eat? However, Chu Qingyan didn't know how shocked Huang Yi was when she came in to add food. Her lord had always eaten alone. Even when he ate outside, he never ate with a woman. Today, he made an exception for Chu Qingyan. She calmed herself down and looked carefully at the woman at the table. Other than being cute and delicate, she couldn't find anything that attracted the lord. She secretly wondered if it was because this Chu Qingyan was too young. Was the lord taking pity on her? But that couldn't be right. Xiao Su naturally didn't know the servant girl's shocked thoughts. When he saw Chu Qingyan sitting there awkwardly, he couldn't help but frown. Did eating with him make her feel wronged? Why aren't you eating? His cold tone, coupled with his depressed mood, made Chu Qingyan's heart tremble. The chopsticks in her hand became unstable and fell on the table with a clatter. Chu Qingyan froze. It's over. Chapter 34. This ruckus successfully made Xiao Su frown. He stared coldly at Chu Qingyan, who was just short of digging a hole and burrowing into it with an iron grip. Chu Qingyan wanted to cry, but no tears came out. She really didn't do it on purpose. Who asked him to suddenly make a sound? She was already frightened, so how could she withstand his shock? But even if she said that, she wouldn't dare to pull the whiskers of a tiger in front of a tiger. Sorry, my hand slipped. Chu Qingyan squeezed out this sentence. Hand slipped. Xiao Su had deep doubts about this explanation. Not to your liking. Xiao Su put down his chopsticks and looked at her. Chu Qingyan was dumbfounded. She thought that the King of England would punish her, but she didn't expect him to ask a completely unrelated question. No, I like it very much. Pfft, it's so spicy. Chu Qingyan wanted to verify that she liked the food very much, so she didn't care and stuffed her chopsticks into her mouth. Who knew that the result of her carelessness was that she picked up a piece of fiery red chili, and she quickly spat it out. However, misfortune never comes alone. The chili flew into the soup bowl not far away, splashing the soup, and then, Chu Qingyan couldn't help but cover her eyes. She really didn't do it on purpose. Xiao Su looked down at his sleeve that was splashed with soup, and the corner of his eyes couldn't help but twitch. Sorry, I didn't do it on purpose. I'll wipe it clean for you. Chu Qingyan immediately stood up and wanted to use her sleeve to help him wipe it. Unfortunately, the other party didn't seem to appreciate it and raised his hand to signal her not to come close. He then took the cloth from the servant girl and wiped the soup on his wrist and sleeves. Finally, he stood up and turned to walk into the room, leaving only one sentence, "You eat by yourself." Chu Qingyan looked at the figure walking away and couldn't help but feel frustrated. She seemed to have offended her patron, and the first impression was already so bad. How can they get along in the future? Chu Qingyan rubbed her chin in annoyance, her chopsticks poking at the rice in her bowl. Originally, she wanted to perform well. Maybe if the King of England was happy, he would let her stay in the prince's mansion. If she had a good relationship with a financial backer, at least she would have freedom. But for some reason, when she first laid eyes on this Prince Ing, she felt a little apprehensive. She wasn't worried that he would kill her in a moment of displeasure. Instead, she was facing a man with an extremely strong presence. Moreover, his entire body was emitting an unapproachable aura. She still hadn't thought of how to treat him. Just when Chu Qingyan was distressed, she saw a servant girl dressed in yellow changing the soup that she had just dirted. She suddenly remembered what she had learned from Xining about the King of England. The King of England had 7 servant girls, named after the 7 rainbows. They were Hong Yi, Cheng Yi, Huang Yi, Lve, Qing Yi, Lan Yi, and Zi Yi. Each of them had their own strengths. For example, Hong Yi was good at housekeeping. She was responsible for taking care of the inner courtyard and coordinating all the servants. She was famous for her gentle temper and was trusted by the King of England. Cheng Yi was responsible for the King of England's clothes and accessories, but she had a fiery temper. Except for the King of England and Hong Yi, few people could make her bow her head. Huang Yi had good cooking skills. She was only responsible for the King of England's meals. Her personality was naive and romantic. Lve was responsible for the King of England's daily life. She was also gentle to people. Qing Yi was responsible for travel, but according to Xining's introduction, her personality was a bit strange. Lan Yi was responsible for taking care of the study. Her personality was gentle and understanding. Zi was still young. Her personality was a bit spoiled and she was still in the training stage. These women were easy to recognize because the color of their clothes was like their names. The servant girl in light yellow clothes in front of her was undoubtedly Huang Yi. The one who had followed the King of England into the inner room was wearing peach-colored clothes should be Hong Yi. Unfortunately, she had only taken a quick glance and did not see Hong Yi's appearance clearly. However, just the back view alone was enough to make people feel that her temperament was not inferior to that of a daughter of a noble family. And this Huang Yi in front of her had big almond eyes and was delicate and charming. She did not look like a servant girl at all. Just as Chu Qingyan was staring at her in a daze, Huang Yi felt that this ninth young Miss Chu's big eyes were really unbearable. Perhaps it was because she had just entered the Fu and was unfamiliar with many things that she had such a timid expression. Huang Yi looked at the untouched food and could not help but speak softly. She was afraid that she would scare this little girl. She asked, "Are these dishes not to your liking? How about ninth young Miss Chu tell this servant about your favorite dishes and this servant will make them for you now?" Just as Xining had said, her personality was simple and unaffected. Chu Qingyan immediately shook her head and bit her chopsticks as if she was about to cry. This older sister, is Lord angry? Seeing the pink and tender little girl reveal such a pitiful appearance, Huang Yi felt that she could not help but feel sad for her. She quickly comforted, "You don't have to worry. Although Lord's personality is a bit indifferent, he treats people very well." After saying this, Huang Yi wanted to bite off her own tongue. How could she say that Lord's personality was indifferent to ninth young Miss Chu, who was about to become the Lord's princess consort? If older sister Hong Yi knew, she would probably be scolded again. But I seem to have made him unhappy just now. Should I go and apologize to him? Chu Qingyan still had a look of unease on her face. Huang Yi breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, the person in front of her was young and did not notice what she had said. She then encouraged her, "That's not impossible. Perhaps Lord will not be unhappy after seeing ninth young Miss Chu's sincerity." Seeing that this Huang Yi was really coaxing her like a child, Chu Qingyan could not help but purse her lips and smile. Indifferent temperament? That's good. In the future, she would not have to worry about this person being temperamental towards her. Thus, Chu Qingyan rolled up her sleeves and pulled the bowl in front of Xiao Su to herself. Then, under Huang Yi's puzzled gaze, she quickly picked up her chopsticks and picked up some food from the various dishes. She was so fast that Huang Yi was overwhelmed. Chu Qingyan used another bowl to fill it with soup. Then, she said to Huang Yi, "Just now, Lord did not eat much before he was driven away by me. I'll bring it to him now to apologize." Thus, with a bowl in each hand, Chu Qingyan walked unsteadily into the inner room under Huang Yi's dumbfounded gaze. When Huang Yi came back to her senses, she suddenly remembered something. She had forgotten to stop ninth young Miss Chu. Lord's inner room had never allowed outsiders to enter. She covered her eyes. "Ninth young Miss Chu, you're on your own now." Smoke rose in spirals from the stove. The simple and clean decoration made one feel as if they were in a bamboo forest in summer. Only clean and refreshing could be described. However, a certain someone did not notice this at this time, because she neglected one thing. Her small hands were not enough to support these two seemingly inconspicuous bowls, but were actually as heavy as stones. wouldn't it be too heavy to eat with such heavy bowls? At this time, Xiao Su, who had changed into a clean set of clothes and was leisurely leaning on a chair, raised his eyebrows when he heard footsteps. Chapter 35. Xiao Su raised his head and saw a small and delicate figure wobbling in. He was a little curious. Wasn't this little girl afraid of him? Why did she still dare to come in? That was because he didn't know that Chu Qingyan was holding onto the heart of currying favor with her patron, which was why she was able to overcome the fear in her heart. Chu Qingyan's mind was completely focused on the 2 bowls of rice in her hands. It wasn't until she reached the center of the room that she raised her head to look for Xiao Su's position. Who knew that when she raised her head, she would meet a pair of cold and beautiful eyes? Her hands immediately trembled and she almost knocked over the bowl of soup. Your Highness, Qingyan saw that you didn't eat anything just now, so Qingyan specially brought some food over. Chu Qingyan mustered up her courage and forced out a smile. Where's the maidservant? Xiao Su looked at the bowl in her hands and said unhurriedly. Chu Qingyan's lips that had just curved up immediately fell. He was blaming her for being meddlesome. However, Chu Qingyan was currently acting as a 10-year-old little girl. How could she be smart enough to understand the meaning behind his words? So Chu Qingyan said with an innocent face, I don't know. I snuck in. Xiao Su's gaze stared at her face for a moment until she lowered her eyes. Only then did he move away. Just leave it there. When Chu Qingyan heard this, it was as if she had been pardoned. She immediately placed the food on the table and secretly shook her sore wrist. She muttered in her heart that she would never do such a thing again. Chu Qingyan's small movements didn't escape Xiao Su's eyes. He thought to himself, with such small hands and feet, she can't even carry a shoulder or lift a hand. What can she accomplish in the future? His fingers couldn't help but lightly tap the table. Chu Qingyan saw that Xiao Su wasn't in the mood to eat and couldn't help but ask, aren't you going to eat? I'm not hungry. 2 faint words blocked her words. Chu Qingyan puffed up her cheeks. This person really cherished his words like gold. Other than the first time they met, his words were a bit long. Today, when they met, he always used 2 or 3 words to dismiss her. If it wasn't for the fact that he was the head of the household in the prince's residence and her future financial backer, she really didn't want to use her hot face to greet his cold face. However, taking advantage of this opportunity, Chu Qingyan was able to take a closer look at the legendary cold-blooded and ruthless lord. His entire face was covered by a silver mask. In her eyes, it added a touch of mystery. In addition to his cold and distant temperament, she felt that he was sacred and noble for no reason. He was tall and wore loose clothes. Because he had just finished bathing and was in his own residence, his belt was casually buckled at his waist. The corners of his mouth were slightly raised, unintentionally revealing a touch of evil charm. Chu Qingyan's gaze fell onto his mask. His every movement had a cold and noble air that normal people rarely had. She really wanted to see if the face behind the mask was just as stunning. But once she thought of this, she quickly stopped this thought because she suddenly remembered something. The reason why he wore a mask was because he had encountered a fire when he was young and his face was disfigured. Chu Qingyan felt a sense of lingering fear in her heart. Curiosity really killed the cat. However, as a prodigy, having his looks disfigured was an extremely sad thing. In the modern realm, she had often seen people who were disfigured and accidentally crippled, causing their hearts to become twisted. She wondered if this was also the reason why this terrifying lord, who was rumored to be so ruthless and unreasonable, had been cursed at for behaving like this. If that was the case, he could be considered a pitiful person. Although Xiao Su had only diverted a bit of his attention to the girl in front of him, he could feel that she was somewhat dissatisfied at first. Then, he saw pity in her eyes. Xiao Su couldn't help but shift his gaze. Seeing her eyes staring unblinkingly at the mask on his face, his eyes couldn't help but turn cold. Just as he was about to open his mouth to chase her away, the little girl in front of him suddenly opened her mouth. "Lord, my name is Chu Qingyan. I'm new here, please take care of me." The little girl opened a pair of big eyes and looked at him with a smile. Her voice had the unique sweetness of Jiangnan. Her tone was slightly raised, and there was a little bit of caution in it. He couldn't help but think of a furry kitten, and the coldness in his eyes melted a lot. Chu Qingyan laughed until her cheeks were stiff, but the person in front of her did not react at all. Chu Qingyan once again confirmed that this person was indeed cold and aloof. No, he was extremely cold and aloof. He did not even bother to say a single word. "You know how to read?" Xiao Su asked. Chu Qingyan once again couldn't keep up with the person in front of her, but she subconsciously shook her head. What a joke. She was just a 10-year-old girl who grew up in the countryside. How could she possibly know how to read? Even if she told him the truth, it would make him suspicious. She might as well deny it. "Play the zither?" Xiao Su continued to ask. Chu Qingyan stared blankly for a moment before shaking her head. She really didn't know how to do that. "Paint?" Xiao Su still asked expressionlessly. This time, Chu Qingyan slowly shook her head. It was obviously very normal that she didn't know how to read, but when it came from his mouth, why did she feel like she had no face to see anyone? After asking, Xiao Su changed his posture and leaned back on the chair. His tone was indifferent. "Then I can't give you any advice." Chu Qingyan raised her head to look at him. After thinking for a long time, she finally came back to her senses. This person was very cunning. She only said a sentence, "Thank you for your advice," and this person took it seriously. In the end, she felt so ashamed that she couldn't show her face. Seeing that the little girl was at a loss because of his teasing, Xiao Su's mood suddenly became much better. He stood up. "Then let's grind." What did he mean? Chu Qingyan completely didn't understand what this eccentric lord wanted to do. It wasn't until she saw him standing in front of the desk with a weasel brush in his hand that she reacted. She immediately trotted over and found the ink stick on the table. She added some water to the ink stick and began to grind it seriously. Xiao Su saw that she was very obedient and his heart was somewhat satisfied. She wasn't even as tall as his chest. Standing by the desk and seriously grinding the ink stick, she was like a little page boy, obedient and quiet. However, this was Chu Qingyan's first time grinding, so it was very slow. She added too little water, so the ink didn't come out for a long time. Fortunately, Xiao Su wasn't in a hurry. He sat on the chair and picked up a book to read. Chu Qingyan saw this and sighed in relief. She gently wiped the sweat on her face. When she was done, she turned her head happily and said, "It's done." Xiao Su glanced at her, then picked up the weasel brush and wrote on the white paper that was spread out. She didn't know if it was an illusion, but Chu Qingyan kept feeling that his gaze seemed to have lingered on her for a long time. Just as she was feeling puzzled, a clear and cold voice was heard. "Xiao Su." Chu Qingyan turned to look at him. Why did this person call her name? It wasn't until her gaze fell on the paper that she understood that he was telling her how to write his name. You can be illiterate, but you can't not recognize this king's name. Chu Qingyan's first thought when she heard this was that this person was really overbearing. It wasn't until she walked out of the room and saw Xining, who had been waiting for a long time, that she relaxed. "Master, why is your face covered in ink?" Xining looked at her master, who looked like a little tabby cat, and couldn't help laughing out loud. Chu Qingyan touched her face. No wonder the King of England looked at her with a strange gaze. However, she turned back to look at the dimly lit main courtyard and gave a low laugh. Her performance today should be enough to make people feel that she was just a 10-year-old girl who didn't know the ways of the world. She couldn't not understand that Xiao Su was testing her today. It was only because she was too young that he didn't pay too much attention to it. Once she entered a noble family, it was as deep as the sea. What she needed to do was to reduce her presence and not let people think about her. She pretended to panic and drop her chopsticks, splashing soup all over him. She anxiously apologized and carefully ground the ink. Chu Qingyan rubbed her chin. She never thought that there would be a day when she could compete with the best actress. Now she could peacefully live her life as a rice worm. It was a pity that there was always a higher mountain. Her little thoughts didn't escape a certain someone's eyes. Chapter 36. After meeting up with Xining, Chu Qingyan looked back at the deserted room and couldn't help but think of the scene just now. With one hand tucked in his sleeve and the other holding a brush, he looked so carefree. If it wasn't for the mask on his face, she would have thought that he was an immortal from the 9 heavens who didn't care about the secular world. Unfortunately, the reality was the opposite. His face had gone through terrible destruction. She heard that it was unrecognizable. What a pity for his temperament. But what did being ugly have to do with being beautiful? She, Chu Qingyan, had never cared about these things. It was just that he didn't seem to have any relationship with her. At this time, Chu Qingyan was more concerned about the reason why she wrote his name on the blank paper. Was it because she couldn't read and couldn't understand it, or did she just want to write it on a whim? Chu Qingyan couldn't guess. After all, she and he were just strangers who had met twice. Maybe they would be familiar with each other in the future, but they shouldn't be close to each other. Chu Qingyan shook her head. At this time, her focus shouldn't be on this. She should be thinking about whether or not she would be able to live a carefree old age in the King of England's residence in advance. She didn't care whether her actions just now were hidden or not. It seemed that he wouldn't be looking for her in the next period of time. As she thought about this, Chu Qingyan couldn't help but smile. She brought Xining with her and was about to head back to her own courtyard when Chu Qingyan suddenly stopped. At this time, a gentle and pleasant voice sounded in Chu Qingyan's ear, "Ninth young Miss Chu." Chu Qingyan heard this and stopped. She looked back and saw a beautiful woman in peach red slightly bowing to her. If she remembered correctly, this woman was the King of England's maidservant, Hong Yi, who was in charge of the backyard. She was indeed a beauty. Chu Qingyan smacked her lips. A maidservant who was in charge of the meals was already so beautiful. Now there was another one who was as pure as jade. The King of England was really lucky with women. Just as Chu Qingyan was admiring her beauty, Hong Yi walked up to her and said gently, "This servant is Hong Yi, who serves Lord. If ninth young Miss Chu has any needs in the future, you can send a servant girl to the main courtyard to inform this servant." "Thank you, Big Sister Hong Yi." "Big Sister Hong Yi, you're really as gentle and kind as everyone says. You're also so beautiful. Can I really trouble you in the future?" Chu Qingyan's eyes were wide open, filled with joy and fear of being rejected. Hong Yi's smile deepened when she saw the innocent smile in front of her. "Ninth young Miss Chu is too polite. It is this servant's honor to serve ninth young Miss Chu." Chu Qingyan grabbed her arm and jumped 3 feet high in joy. "That's great. It's a promise." After reluctantly bidding farewell to Hong Yi, Chu Qingyan was about to step out of the door when she heard a very faint conversation behind her. It was so faint that she might have missed it if she hadn't been paying attention. "Big Sister Hong Yi, who were you talking to just now?" A sharp female voice rang out. "Ninth young Miss Chu." "Oh, that girl from the Chu family who was forced to marry the prince and doesn't know her own limits?" "Qingyi, don't say that," she couldn't hear what they were saying after that. It wasn't until they left the main courtyard that Xining happily said, "Master, Xining was right. Big Sister Hong Yi is really an easy person to get along with. Many people in the residence like her very much." Chu Qingyan only smiled in agreement. She narrowed her eyes at the crescent moon in the night sky. Perhaps her life from now on wouldn't be too comfortable. Everything was just as Chu Qingyan had predicted. Her life as a rice worm in the King of England's residence wasn't very comfortable. For example, she finally managed to lie in bed last night and wanted to sleep in, but she was woken up in the middle of the night by someone. "Xining, it's not even dawn yet. Why did you wake me up?" Although she didn't have a morning temper, it didn't mean that she could endure being disturbed from her sleep. "Master, don't sleep. A servant came just now and said that Lord wants you to go to Yushuan Garden now." Xining didn't want to disturb Master, but there was no other way. Someone from the top came. Chu Qingyan was still fighting with the gods at this time. She said impatiently, "Who the hell is Lord? What the hell is Yushuan Garden? Let them all go to hell. Don't disturb my sleep." Xining was shocked by her master's bold words. She immediately pulled the quilt and freed a hand to cover her master's mouth. With a horrified expression, she said, "Master, Lord isn't a ghost. He's your future husband. Have you forgotten about Yushuan Garden? You just went there yesterday." After being grabbed and covered by Xining, Chu Qingyan couldn't go back to sleep even if she wanted to. She lifted the quilt and her hair was messy on her face. She looked like she wanted to cry but had no tears. What the hell is going on? My rice worm life, hey! Although she was full of anger, it didn't affect Xining from helping her put on her clothes and braiding her hair. However, Xining was a half-grown child. It was already good enough that she could tidy her up to look like a human. Before Chu Qingyan could see her appearance clearly in the mirror, she was already pushed out of the courtyard by Xining. Chu Qingyan was dragged along by Xining as she ran, stumbling all the way. She secretly swore in her heart that if she went and the King of England didn't say anything bad, she would cry in front of him. Disturbing people's dreams was a heinous crime. The two of them arrived at Yushuan Garden and went straight into the room. "Greetings to Lord." Xining hurriedly knelt down and pulled her master, who was already dizzy and disoriented, hinting her to pay her respects. People under the eaves have no choice but to lower their heads. Chu Qingyan lowered her head and paid her respects. Pfft, just as she stood still, she heard laughter. Chu Qingyan raised her head in confusion and saw Huang Yi covering her mouth and looking at her. At this moment, a knotty strand of hair fell from her forehead. She subconsciously touched it and felt something strange. She immediately turned to look at Xining. Sure enough, Xining's face was full of guilt. What kind of hairstyle did she give herself today? Was it a pervert? She even had the heart to die. Just at this moment, a familiar emotionless voice came from above, "Don't dawdle." "What are you dawdling about for?" Chu Qingyan didn't quite understand, but when she raised her head and saw Xiao Su sitting at the dining table and looking at her coldly, she immediately understood. Could it be that he was waiting for her to eat? Sure enough, Huang Yi said with a smile, "Ninth young Miss Chu, quickly take a seat. Otherwise, the food will get cold. Lord still has to rush to the morning court later. It won't be good if the time is delayed." But just as Huang Yi finished speaking, her lord gave her a cold glance. Huang Yi immediately shut up and didn't dare to say anything more. But Chu Qingyan didn't notice this scene. She subconsciously looked at the still pitch black outside the window, and her heart thumped her chest and stamped her feet. Oh my God, he woke her up in the middle of the night just to have breakfast. What's wrong with him? Chapter 37. Just as Chu Qingyan was pounding her chest and stamping her feet, a certain someone was enjoying his breakfast with a clear conscience, without the slightest awareness that he had disturbed her sleep. Last night, in order to understand the situation in the King of England's residence, she chatted with Xining until midnight. Now, she only felt that her eyelids were very heavy, and she wanted to play chess with Zhou Gong. But the person at the same table seemed to be unwilling to let her do as she wished. His low voice was as pleasant as the sound of a bell, but it was also shocking. Not awake yet? With this great Buddha here, how could she dare to tell the truth? She woke up with a quiver and repeatedly waved her hand. No, 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 I slept enough. Oh. Then you slept well. A certain someone seemed to be interested, and asked indifferently while picking up food. A drop of cold sweat appeared on her forehead. Could she say that the bed was very hard, and the quilt had a whooshing smell? But how could she say that the guest was not treated well in front of the host? No, she didn't seem to be a guest now, but what was she? Just as Chu Qingyan was entangled in this problem, Xiao Su glanced at her and raised his voice. N? Chu Qingyan's back was covered in fine sweat from his rising and falling voice. Why did this King of England always make her feel like a dormant snow wolf? His slightly cold eyes were as cold as snow. I slept very well, there was nothing wrong with it. She laughed and said. Xiao Su didn't look at her again, but focused on eating. Chu Qingyan breathed a sigh of relief and didn't dare to be absent-minded and dozed off again. She obediently picked up the chopsticks to fill her stomach. Although she wasn't hungry, she still had to put on an act. After eating a few mouthfuls, she saw Xiao Su put down his chopsticks and nimbly get up. At this time, a female voice sounded from her side. Lord, this is your clothes for today's court. This voice was somewhat familiar. Chu Qingyan bit her chopsticks and turned her head, just in time to meet a pair of ridiculing eyes. Her orange-colored clothes accentuated her lustrous skin. Her slightly deep eyes and her raised chin seemed a little mean when she looked at others. If she didn't guess wrong, this person was Cheng Yi, who was in charge of the King of England's clothes and accessories. She was also the woman who said to Hong Yi in the courtyard yesterday that she didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. Chu Qingyan bit her chopsticks and smiled at her in a friendly manner. Unfortunately, the other party simply ignored her and handed the clothes in her hands to her lord. Xiao Su took the robe and put it on quickly. Then, he said to Chu Qingyan, who was still sitting at the table, I need to talk to Hong Yi. Then, he strode away. Chu Qingyan was stunned. Did he just leave like that? He had woken her up early in the morning just to eat a few mouthfuls of rice. At this time, only Chu Qingyan, Huang Yi, and Cheng Yi were in the room. Cheng Yi snorted coldly at her, then ignored her and walked out of the room. It seemed that even talking to her was degrading herself. Huang Yi thought that she would be sad and hurriedly explained, please don't mind her. Sister Cheng Yi's personality is like this. Other than Lord and Hong Yi, she has never given anyone a good look. Chu Qingyan shook her head timidly. It's okay. I don't mind. Seeing Chu Qingyan's well-behaved appearance despite being wronged, Huang Yi's heart couldn't help but soften. She really wanted to raise her hand and pat her head to comfort her. No wonder Lord ordered people to bring 9th Miss Chu over. Looking at 9th Miss Chu's delicate face, it was easy to eat. Chu Qingyan didn't know what Huang Yi was thinking at all. Otherwise, she probably wouldn't even be able to eat. What kind of joke was this? This person was here to torture her. Huo Ling asked a certain person walking in the courtyard in confusion, Lord, why did you call her over? I was just in the mood. Huo Ling sighed. Lord's mood was really high. Early in the morning, actually, Chu Qingyan also really wanted to say, who did she offend this early in the morning? Xiao Su had just left the Prince Fu when she returned to her own courtyard. Although that courtyard was a bit secluded and dirty, it was at least enough for her small body to rest. Chu Qingyan slept until late in the morning. Just as she was rubbing her stomach and complaining that she was hungry, she saw Xining rushing in with a smile. Chu Qingyan couldn't help but tease, could it be that there's a wolf dog chasing after you? Master, what are you talking about? It's a good thing. Xining giggled. What good thing? Although the most important thing for her right now was to fill her stomach, it wasn't good to dampen this little maidservant's enthusiasm. Another servant from Yu Xian Garden said that Lord is inviting you over. Xining happily said. Her thoughts were very simple. If her master could please Lord, then their lives would be better in the future. But when her master heard this news, she collapsed on the bed. Wasn't this something to be happy about? Chu Qingyan naturally didn't know the doubts in the little lass's heart. Her current mood was, why was the ghost king looking for her? Could it be that he wanted to eat with her again? Don't. Facing his ice-cold mask, she wouldn't be able to eat. But reality was this cruel. When Chu Qingyan entered Yuxian Garden again, there was a table of food in front of her. It was still exquisite and delicious, but it wasn't the same. Chu Qingyan respectfully bowed. Her slightly bent legs trembled and her face turned slightly pale. Because her courtyard was really far from here, she had to make 3 trips in just 1 or 2 days. Even if she was a boy, she wouldn't be able to bear it. Xiao Su didn't seem to notice her abnormality and faintly glanced at her. Chu Qingyan immediately understood that he meant for her to sit down. This time, Chu Qingyan's arrival once again deepened the guess in Huang Yi's heart. Sure enough, Lord was looking for 9th Miss Chu to eat. Huang Yi came in to report matters. When she saw Chu Qingyan here, she was slightly stunned. Then she smiled at her and began to report the matters in the residence. Chu Qingyan wasn't interested in their conversation at all. She looked at the food in front of her with some annoyance. What happened this morning, she thought it was just the King of England's whim. But now, he was even accompanying her for lunch. She couldn't understand what the King of England was thinking. She was clearly just a 10-year-old girl and not a beauty that could cause the downfall of a country. Was there a need for the King of England to call her by his side? Besides, didn't he not approve of this marriage? He should have cast her far away. What the eye doesn't see, the heart doesn't grieve over. Why would he bring her around blindly? Wasn't this just making things difficult for her? After Hong Yi finished speaking, Xiao Su began to move his chopsticks. But he saw Chu Qingyan's hesitant look. He raised his eyebrows. Ben Wang doesn't like to hesitate. If you have something to say, say it. It was rare for this person to speak so much. Chu Qingyan immediately put down her chopsticks and sat upright. She had the perfect innocent smile of a child on her face. She asked expectantly, Lord, can Qingyan eat with Lord in the future? You don't want to. The temperature suddenly dropped, and his words were oppressive. Chu Qingyan didn't seem to sense the displeasure in his tone and cheered, how can that be? It's Qingyan's honor to be able to eat with Lord. I can't be happier. Actually, her heart was wailing. Bastard, I have to walk such a long distance every day. My calves will become thicker. How could Xiao Su not see the resistance in the depths of her eyes? He smiled slightly. Chu Qingyan, let's see how long you can last. Chapter 38. Because there was no need to go to court like this morning, this lunch was rather long. At least in Chu Qingyan's eyes, it was really long. However, Chu Qingyan found that this King of England ate in a refined and elegant manner. Look at this King of England eating slowly, his right hand holding the chopsticks did not touch the table the entire time, and there was not a single sound. Unlike her, even if she drank the soup, no matter how careful she was, there was still a slight sound. This made Chu Qingyan, who had always flaunted herself as a virtuous lady, blush with shame. At the same time, Chu Qingyan was also a little puzzled. She heard that this King of England was stationed at the border all year round, so how could he not be affected by the rough and unruly nature of the army? Is there a flower on this king's face? This sentence suddenly interrupted Chu Qingyan's thoughts. Her 6 senses returned to their original position, and when she once again looked into Xiao Su's calm eyes, it was as if she was hit by an ice arrow, her 5 viscera and 6 bowels were all cold. Chu Qingyan hurriedly pulled out a smile. No, it's just that Qingyan saw the Lord's wisdom and martial prowess, so she couldn't help but be infatuated. Nonsense. Xiao Su's eyes showed that he didn't believe it. Huang Yi, who was accompanying him on the side, heard this and didn't dare to laugh. If this sentence came from the mouth of a young girl at the age of Jasper, it might be somewhat believable. Unfortunately, His Royal Highness was wearing a mask, so this lie was exposed. Chu Qingyan realized in hindsight, so she couldn't help but lightly stick out her tongue. She suddenly blurted it out. Fortunately, Xiaosu didn't dwell on this issue. Chu Qingyan thought that Xiaosu didn't notice the flaw, but in fact, she didn't know that Xiaosu felt that it was ungentlemanly to argue with a little girl, so he let her go. After dinner, Chu Qingyan was still miserably ordered by Xiaosu to grind ink on the desk. Before this, there was already a maidservant dressed in aqua blue clothes tidying up the desk. When she saw Xiaosu walk in with Chu Qingyan, she immediately saluted. When she learned that Chu Qingyan wanted to grind the ink stick, she immediately stepped forward to prepare the ink stick and the inkstone, and then retreated to the side. Chu Qingyan glanced at the maidservant and was slightly surprised. What a quiet and scholarly woman. Perhaps her appearance was not very outstanding, but as long as she stood there without moving, it was hard to ignore her. Chu Qingyan once again cast a look of envy at Xiaosu. It really was a room full of beauties, and they were all different kinds of women. Xiaosu ignored the strange look in Chu Qingyan's eyes and looked up at her. What are you waiting for? Sensing his displeasure, Chu Qingyan immediately stepped forward and obediently began to grind the ink stick. Ignoring her obedient appearance, Xiaosu picked up a book and casually flipped through it. Chu Qingyan helplessly sighed in her heart. When would these days end? After these days repeated for 3 days, Chu Qingyan felt that she could not take it anymore. She was once again awakened in the middle of the night. When she got up to eat breakfast with him, Chu Qingyan decided to lay her cards on the table with him. Thus, Chu Qingyan anxiously waited for him to return from court. When it was almost noon, Xiaosu returned. During this meal, Xiaosu felt that she was particularly attentive. For example, the moment she came back, she praised him for his good looks, enthusiastically introduced the dishes, and even urged him to eat more. Although she would occasionally say a few words during meals, this was completely unlike her usual obedient self. There must be a reason for this abnormality. However, Xiaosu's lips curved. He was actually looking forward to what she was going to do. Chu Qingyan's plan was to make him happy first before she threw out her decision. She did not expect that he would see through her plan before she even put it into action. Chu Qingyan thought that she had smoothed out the other party's hair. As she ground the ink, Chu Qingyan rotated her wrist and said, "Your Highness, Qingyan has something to tell you." Chu Qingyan held the book and replied calmly, "Speak." Chu Qingyan glanced at him and said in a self-reproachful tone, "Lord, Qingyan realized that if you wait for me to eat breakfast together, it might delay your morning court session. In order to save your time, Qingyan does not have to accompany you for breakfast in the future. Otherwise, if His Majesty gets angry and blames you for being late, wouldn't that be Qingyan's fault?" Chu Qingyan nervously observed his reaction as she spoke. "Oh." This single syllable was a little long, and it made Chu Qingyan's heart tremble. Then she heard him say unhurriedly, "This prince's horses are all good steeds that are picked from thousands of miles away. It's not a problem for them to travel 1,000 li in a day, let alone such a short distance. However, it's thoughtful of you to think this way. In the future, I'll have the servants wake you up half an incense's time in advance. 4 taels to 1,000 caddies." He directly rejected her request. Chu Qingyan's heart instantly turned cold. This was simply courting death. If he woke her up half an incense's time in advance, wouldn't that mean that she could only sleep for 6 hours a night? "Hey, my beauty, sleep." She wanted to refute, but he calmly flipped a page of the book, indicating that this matter was over. Chu Qingyan gritted her teeth and endured it. One plan did not work, so she had to come up with another. The next day, a servant went to Chu Qingyan's small courtyard and came back panting. Xiao Su saw that there was only Chu Qingyan's servant following behind him, and he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. Reporting to Lord, my master accidentally sprained her ankle on the way back yesterday. I'm afraid that she won't be able to see Lord today. Xining didn't dare to look at Lord, who was glowing with a silver light. She trembled as she finished what her master had instructed her to say last night. Gu Rong. This subordinate is here. Xining didn't understand why Lord called for the guards when she was talking about her master's matters. Bring the Chu family's young miss here. Xiao Su buttoned his wrist and calmly said. Gu Rong was slightly surprised, but she still immediately responded, as you command. Xining was so scared that she almost fell to the ground. She turned her head to look at Lord. Although he was still standing there calmly, why did she feel a chill run down her spine? Chu Qingyan, who was deep in slumber, was woken up mercilessly. When she opened her sleepy eyes, the first thing she saw was a carriage. When she saw Gu Rong's half-smile, she immediately understood what was going on. Her eyes rolled back, and she almost fainted. This Xiao Su really was like a ghost that wouldn't go away. But it didn't matter, she still had a plan. The third day. The servants still only brought Xining. Although Xining didn't agree with her master's actions, she still reported her master's instructions as they were. Lord, my master caught a cold yesterday and she's not feeling well. Not feeling well? Xiao Su repeated these 3 words. Yes, she's had a stomachache since last night. Xining felt that ever since she followed her master, her ability to lie through her teeth was increasing day by day. Oh. Xiao Su still dragged out the word meaningfully. Chu Qingyan narrowed her eyes as she waited for Xining's good news. When she saw her come back panting, she couldn't help but feel happy. It seemed that her plan had succeeded. When she saw Xining carrying something in her hand, she couldn't help but ask with a smile, "What are you holding in your hand?" Xining took a deep breath and said with a lingering fear, "Lord asked this servant to give this to you." Chu Qingyan took it in confusion. She gently opened the bag and saw that it was filled with small green beans. Croton. Chapter 39. It's actually croton. Chu Qingyan is so angry that her chest is heaving up and down. Xining didn't dare to open the bag all the way here, so when she sees her master's mood fluctuating, she can't help but look inside. When she sees the green beans, her eyes widen. Why did Lord give you these croton for? Could it be that he saw through your scheme? Chu Qingyan jumps up from the bed. Right now, he's hoping that I can't get out of bed because of an upset stomach. I won't. I want to make it clear to him right now what exactly he wants to do. She originally thought that after she entered the prince's residence, he would treat her as heir and put her aside, but she didn't expect that he would tease her again and again. She and he have only met a few times, and they didn't have any grudges or deep hatred, so why does he want to make things difficult for her? She doesn't care if the place she lives in is bad. She also doesn't care if the place she lives in is far away. But why does he have to call her in front of him every day and torture her every day? Chu Qingyan doesn't care about the blisters that have formed on her feet these past few days. She runs towards Yushuan courtyard like the wind. Xining can't react to this unforeseen event, and when she comes back to her senses, she almost can't catch up with her master. Until a long time later, when Chu Qingyan recalls what happened today, she can't help but wonder why she, who is usually calm and steady, can't hold back her temper and actually have the guts to run over and challenge the Ghost King, who can make people laugh and change things. Actually, it's just that at that time, she is not used to the prince's residence yet. She was caught unprepared, and the physical torture, as well as the longing for her father and mother in her heart, all of these accumulated emotions, resulting in the current scene. Xiao Su, tell me honestly, what do you want me to do for you to let me go? At this moment, in front of Xiao Su, Chu Qingyan's eyes were red with anger, her cheeks were red, and her hair was about to stand on end. She was like an explosive little beast that made people want to touch her and play with her. When Chu Qingyan ignored the servants and rushed in, Xiaosu couldn't help but be surprised. To be honest, he was looking forward to her next move, but he didn't expect that he would provoke her so quickly. Did you eat something bad? Xiaosu had just finished his breakfast and was in a good mood as he sized up the little beast in front of him. There was a hint of ridicule in his tone. As soon as Xiaosu said this, everyone who was busy was shocked. She wasn't shocked by Chu Qingyan's rudeness, nor was she shocked by Chu Qingyan's words. She was shocked by her lord's attitude. This was the first time he had seen Lord not get angry when someone called him by his full name. It seemed that the last person who came looking for trouble had already died. However, Chu Qingyan was still standing in front of them, perfectly fine. She even dared to stare at His Highness with wide eyes. The servants did not know if they should be worried for Chu Qingyan or for themselves because of His Highness' abnormal behavior today. Chu Qingyan was shocked when she heard this. She had left in a hurry and forgot about the lie she had made up. But now that they had decided to shed all pretense of cordiality, there was no need to care about this. Besides, she didn't believe that he didn't see through this. Chu Qingyan raised her eyebrows and coldly said, "Lord, please don't change the topic. Tell me, what will it take for you to let me go?" Change the topic? That's a good choice of words. It seems that you have some knowledge. Xiaosu picked up the teacup on the table and leisurely said, using facts to explain the meaning of this word. You, Chu Qingyan didn't expect him to be so mischievous. She took 3 steps forward and stood in front of him. With lightning speed, she reached out and grabbed his collar. She originally thought that with his martial arts, it wouldn't be so easy to grab him. But in reality, it was much easier than her clothes. Huang Yi and the others immediately covered their eyes. It was over. The Chu family's young miss was throwing an egg against a rock. She didn't want to live anymore. But they didn't hear the prince's rage, nor did they hear the 9th young mistress of the Chu clan cry out in anguish. They couldn't help but spread open their fingers one by one and secretly peek through the gaps. They saw the 2 people, one sitting and one standing. One was furious and incredulous, the other was indifferent and had a faint smile. But they gave off a strange feeling of harmony. But this wasn't the main point. Didn't Lord have a serious obsession with cleanliness? He never let anyone touch a corner of his clothes. She remembered that a servant once made a mistake and grabbed Lord's sleeve and begged. Lord immediately pulled out his sword and cut off that sleeve, along with the servant's hand. But what was the situation now? Not only did Lord not punish Chu family's 9th young miss, he even spoke to her with a calm expression. Everyone froze on the spot. What was going on? Was there anyone who could explain the situation? Chu Qingyan was stunned at first, but then the corners of her mouth rose, revealing a sly fox's smile. She lowered her voice and leaned close to him. Unhurriedly, she gritted her teeth and said, "What are you planning in your heart? I don't believe that a mere girl from the declining Chu family is worth your scheming. On the other hand, as a dignified prince of a dynasty, there's no need for you to lower yourself to tease a weak and powerless young lady. Don't you think so? Unable to even truss a chicken." Xiaosu glanced at her hand that was tightly gripping his collar. Chu Qingyan met his gaze and her hand couldn't help but shake, but she still resisted the pressure and looked straight at him. "You're right. The declining Chu family is indeed not worth this prince's effort. And you're even more insignificant, so you're not worth this prince's lowering himself." Xiaosu didn't seem to see her hand as he picked up his teacup, his posture elegant and unrestrained. These words sounded like nonsense. Chu Qingyan pressed down on the bulging veins on her temples and resisted the urge to beat him up, even though she couldn't beat him. She let out a heavy sigh and calmly asked, "His Royal Highness, important things must be said 3 times. What will it take for you to let me go? This prince has never captured you, so how can I let you go?" Xiao Su glanced at her hand again, as if to say that the person in her hand was him. Chu Qingyan forcefully suppressed her anger and closed her eyes. Don't be angry, don't be angry. Then she opened her eyes again and said with gritted teeth, don't you have anything you want to say right now? I do. Xiao Su's words made Chu Qingyan's eyes light up. She immediately focused on listening. Hurry and say it. My neck is itching from your grip. He said those seemingly frivolous words with a serious expression. It was like she had gathered all her strength and staked it all on a single throw, only to hit a ball of cotton. All of her courage and strength seemed to have run out. Chu Qingyan looked at the person in front of her and her eyes hurt. 2 streams of tears suddenly flowed out. She let go of her hand and slowly squatted down. She hugged her knees and began to cry loudly. Everyone was stunned by this scene, including Xiao Su, who had always been calm and collected. You're tuning into the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.